On a spring morning in 1478, the finest painter in Florence climbed a scaffold beside the city hall and went to work on a mural of hanged men. His name was Sandro Botticelli. Within a few years, he would paint the birth of Venus, the most beloved image of the entire Renaissance. That morning, the government of Florence was paying him 40 gold florins to paint corpses, life-sized, dangling by the neck, so accurate that citizens could name each face. The models were real. Some of them were still swinging from the windows of the palace above him, and one of the bodies wore the full robes of an archbishop. For 3 days, this city of bankers and wool merchants had been killing people. A mob had dragged conspirators through the streets, turned one man apart in the piazza, and hanged an archbishop of the Roman Church from a government window in his sacred vestments. The crowd was avenging an attack on 2 brothers, private citizens, who held no office and wore no crown. Officially, the brothers were bankers. The men who tried to murder them planned it the way you plan the killing of kings. In a cathedral, at high mass, with the archbishop in on the plot and an army waiting outside the walls. So here is the question that mural leaves behind. The question this whole story exists to answer. How does a family of loan officers become so powerful that killing them requires a conspiracy of popes and princes? How does a republic, a city that spent 2 centuries making sure no man could ever be king, end up ruled by men who never bothered to take the title? The answer starts 80 years earlier, with a ledger, a mule, and a sin. Before you can understand why Florence killed for its bankers, you have to understand the machine those bankers captured, because the machine was built, bolt by bolt, to make sure nobody could ever capture it. Florence, at the opening of the 1400s, was the strangest great power in Europe. It had no king and wanted none. It had watched its neighbours fall one by one to strongmen. The Visconti tyrants in Milan, the little lords sprouting all over Italy like mushrooms after rain, and it had organised its entire constitution around a single obsession, making sure that could never happen here. The city called itself the daughter of Republican Rome, the last home of liberty in Italy, and it said so on its buildings, in its speeches. In the letters its chancellors fired off to the tyrants, it was fighting. Look at how the government actually worked, because the design tells you exactly what the designers were afraid of. The city was run by a council of 9 men called the Signoria, and nobody campaigned for the job. Names were drawn from leather bags, by lot, like a raffle, from lists of guild members in good standing. The 9 winners moved into the palace, governed the republic for exactly 2 months, then moved out, and a new drawing was held. 2-month terms, chosen by luck. In any given decade, hundreds of different merchants, lawyers, and tradesmen cycled through the highest office in the state, and power never sat in one pair of hands long enough to grow roots. The whole constitution was a fortress built against ambition. The men in those leather bags came from the guilds, the 21 corporations that were the real skeleton of the city. Wool merchants and bankers at the top, butchers and furriers below, regulating everything from the price of bread to the quality of dye. Florence lived on cloth and money. Raw wool came in from England and Spain, and the city spun it and dyed it into the finest fabric in Europe. An industry feeding perhaps 1/3 of the population. Alongside the cloth, ran the coin. In 1252, the city had begun minting a small gold piece called the florin, a lily on one side, John the Baptist on the other. And while kings all over Europe debased their money whenever a war got expensive, Florence held the florin's weight and purity steady, decade after decade, until every merchant, from a Flemish wool fair to a Cairo spice market, knew exactly what it was worth. The little coin became the dollar of the late Middle Ages, the currency. Other people quoted prices in. The republic that feared kings had built something more durable than most kings ever managed. Now for the honest part the marble inscriptions left out. The republic was rigged. Somebody had to decide whose names went into the bags in the first place. And the committees that vetted the lists were controlled by a knot of rich families, which meant the lottery was theatre. Draw all the names you want. The winners keep coming from the same circle of friends. In the years this story opens, the circle answered to the Albizzi, old money, old blood, masters of the game, who held no throne and needed none. They held the lists, and beneath the rigged game sat a memory that kept every rich man in Florence awake at night. A generation earlier, in 1378, the wool workers had risen. The tens of thousands of labourers who did the actual work and had no guild, no vote, and no future. And for a few astonishing weeks, the mob had held the palace and put labourers into the government. The great families crushed the rising, hanged the leaders, and never forgot the lesson. The city was a furnace with the lid held down. Whoever ruled Florence ruled a population that had torn power from its masters once and remembered the taste. So picture the board as the new century opens. A republic in love with its own liberty, run through a fixed lottery by families who despised each other, sitting on a working class, locked out and simmering, with a constitution designed to strangle any man who reached too high. Florence had machinery for stopping tyrants, machinery for stopping rebels, machinery for stopping ambition itself. What it had no defense against, because nobody had imagined the attack, was a man who wanted power without any of its trappings, a man willing to rule the city without ever once asking Florence to admit it was ruled. That man was about to open a bank. The founder of the most famous fortune in European history arrived in Florence with a problem that no amount of success could fix. His business was a mortal sin. His name was Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, and nothing about his beginnings promised much. The Medici were an old Florentine clan from the Mugello, the hill country north of the city. Respectable, sprawling, and mostly broke. Worse than broke. The name carried a smell. Various Medici of the previous century had piled up a record of street brawls and failed politics, and one branch had backed a disastrous coup. Solid citizens considered the family loud, quarrelsome, and finished. Giovanni was a younger son of a widow, raised on modest means, and he entered the money trade, the only way open to him, as an employee, clerking in a bank owned by a distant cousin in Rome. He learned the business from the inside, ran the Rome branch, and in 1397, at about the age of 37, he moved his operation to Florence and hung out his own sign. That date, as much as any battle or coronation, is where this story begins. One office, a partner or two, and a starting capital that a Milanese duke would have spent on a banquet. A bank in 1397 was nothing like the word suggests. Now, there were no marble lobbies. A bank was a table, a set of ledgers, and a family's word. Deposits came in from merchants and churchmen who needed their money safe and useful. Loans went out. Branches in other cities moved funds across Europe, not by shipping chests of coin down bandit roads, but by paper. Letters of instruction between offices. So, a wool buyer could pay in florins at a desk in Florence, and his supplier could collect in pounds at a desk in London. The men behind the tables tracked it all with a Tuscan bookkeeping method. Every transaction entered twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, the two columns forever in balance. Double entry bookkeeping, the accountants call it, and it still runs the world. Every bank statement in America, every credit card swipe, every quarterly report on Wall Street descends in a straight professional line from the ledgers. Those Tuscan clerks were balancing by candlelight. Now for the sin. The Church of Giovanni's century taught, plainly and officially, that lending money at interest was usury, and that usury damned you. The reasoning came down from Scripture and Aristotle. Money was sterile, a dead thing, and charging rent on a dead thing meant selling time itself, which belonged to God alone. This was no fringe opinion. Dante, Florence's own poet, writing within living memory of Giovanni's grandparents, had toured hell in his great poem and placed the usurers in the burning sand of the seventh circle, below the murderers. Each moneylender crouched for eternity, with his purse hung around his neck. Every banker in Florence had heard that passage, and every banker in Florence knew respectable theologians who said his profession was a one-way road to the fires. The bankers had workarounds, and the workarounds were lawyers' poetry. A loan repaid in a different currency could hide its interest inside the exchange rate. A borrower could add a discretionary gift, freely given. Wink, wink. On top of the principal, the paperwork said currency trading and gratitude, and everyone involved, including the priests taking deposits, understood what it actually said. But a workaround fools a court, and the court that mattered here could see through paper. A banker lived his whole life with a quiet, theological mortgage on his soul, and the church held the lien. Keep that fact in your pocket, because 3 generations of Medici behavior make sense only if you remember that the family business, the source of everything, was something its own owners half believed would send them to hell. The story of this dynasty is, among other things, the story of the longest debt repayment in history, and the final installment will be paid in Rome by a Medici wearing the triple crown of St. Peter. Giovanni's genius was to see where the one safe client in Christendom kept his accounts. The Papacy was the biggest financial operation in Europe. Rents, taxes, and fees flowed to Rome from every parish between Iceland and Cyprus. Rivers of small coins that had to be collected, exchanged, moved, and stored, and the popes had always hired Italian bankers to do it. The bank that landed the papal account became something close to untouchable, and Giovanni spent years positioning himself to land it. His route ran through a friendship that respectable Florence would have crossed the street to avoid. A Neapolitan churchman named Baldassare Cossa, an adventurer whose enemies described him as a former pirate, and exactly the kind of man the age produced when it let ambition into the priesthood. Giovanni's bank helped finance Cossa's rise through the church, and the investment paid off beyond all reason. In 1410, Cossa was elected pope, or at least a pope, since the church in those years was split between rival claimants, and the Medici Bank became the depository of the papal treasury. Florence gossip put it simply: Giovanni had bought a friend, and the friend had bought the throne of St. Peter, and now the money of Christendom ran through a single office off the Florentine wool market. Then the investment collapsed, and Giovanni showed Europe what he was actually made of. A great church council met at Constance to heal the schism, and it deposed Cossa, stripped him of the papacy, and locked him in a German castle. The smart move, every banker in Italy agreed, was to write off the loss and court the new pope. Giovanni instead paid a staggering ransom, well over 30,000 florins, according to later accounts, to buy his ruined friend out of prison. Cossa came back to Florence, a broken ex-pope with nothing left to give, and Giovanni housed him, honored him, and when he died within the year, paid Donatello and his partner to build him a tomb inside the Florentine baptistry itself. Bronze and marble and gilt, a monument fit for a cent, for a deposed pirate pope. The new pope in Rome was furious about the tomb's inscription and demanded changes. Florence declined. Watch what that ransom bought, because Giovanni knew exactly what he was buying. Every ruler, every cardinal, every merchant house in Europe now knew one fact about the Medici Bank. It stood by a client after the client became worthless, in a business that ran entirely on trust. In a century when a bank was a table and a promise, Giovanni had converted 30,000 florins into a reputation no rival could match at any price. The papal account, after some wandering, came home to the Medici and stayed. By the 1420s, the bank had branches or agents in Rome, Venice, Naples, Geneva, and beyond. And Giovanni de Medici, the widow's son from the discredited family, stood among the richest men in Florence, which, in Florence, was a dangerous thing to be. Rich men attracted the tax assessors, the envy of the great families, and the attention of the crowd. Giovanni handled the danger with a discipline that became the family doctrine. He dressed plainly. He declined honors. He served his obligatory turns in public office when the lottery produced his name, did the work without flourish, and went home. When the city debated a sweeping new tax in 1427, the catasto, built on written declarations of every household's wealth, the great families fought it, since transparency was aimed straight at them. Giovanni came out in favor, and the working city noticed which rich man had sided with the assessors against his own class. None of it was accident. His whole public life was a performance of modesty, staged by a man who understood that in this republic, the appearance of ambition was more dangerous than ambition itself. He died in February of 1429, close to 70, leaving the largest private fortune in the city's tax records, and the family tradition preserved a deathbed speech to his sons. Stay out of the public eye. It runs, give no advice unless asked. Take what the voting halls offer. Never chase what they withhold. The speech survives only in accounts written by people loyal to the family, decades later. So, file it as legend, polished after the fact. But whoever composed it, it captures, with complete honesty, the operating manual Giovanni actually lived by, and the inheritance he actually left. The money was the smaller part of it. The larger part was a method, a way of holding power with open hands, and a warning that the son, standing closest to the deathbed, had absorbed more deeply than anyone guessed. That son was named Cosimo. He was 39 years old. twice as rich as any rival, patient as winter, and the great families of Florence were about to discover that the quiet banker's quiet heir was the most dangerous man the Republic had ever produced. For 4 years after his father's funeral, Cosimo de' Medici did nothing, and the nothing was magnificent. He ran the bank, which nearly doubled in his hands. He married his sons into good families. He collected manuscripts, paid the tax assessors more than any man in Florence, and walked to the wool market in plain cloth like a man with modest business and modest hopes. When war taxes squeezed the city, the Medici Bank lent the Republic money to cover its soldiers' pay. When friends of the family stumbled, quiet loans caught them. When enemies of the family looked for a fight, they found no one standing across from them, just a courteous banker who agreed with everything and committed to nothing. A supporter of the old families complained that trying to grip Cosimo was like squeezing water. Every year he grew richer, better connected, and harder to accuse of anything. And the men who ran Florence watched him the way you watch a tide. The man watching most closely was Rinaldo degli Albizzi, heir to the family that held the lists. And Rinaldo understood something his allies kept missing. Cosimo did not need to seek power, because power was drifting to him on its own. Every wool merchant who banked with the Medici, every clerk who owed his job to a Medici word, every craftsman paid from a Medici purse, every indebted noble carrying a Medici loan became, without any oath being sworn, part of something that had no name, no address, and no seat in the palace. The Republic had machinery for fighting a faction. This was worse than a faction. It was a client base, and it voted. Then the war handed Rinaldo his opening. Florence had blundered into a grinding, expensive campaign against the neighboring city of Lucca, and it went badly, as wars run by committees of merchants tend to go. Cosimo had served on the war committee, briefly and without enthusiasm, and when the campaign soured, he stepped back and let other names wear the failure. Taxes climbed, tempers climbed with them, and in the late summer of 1433, with a friendly signoria drawn from the leather bags and a gonfaloniere of justice at its head whom the Albizzi could count on, Rinaldo moved. A summons went out from the palace, an ordinary invitation. The government requesting a word with its leading citizen, Cosimo, who had informants in every corner of that building, walked into the trap with his eyes open, which tells you something important about him. Refusing the summons meant flight, and flight meant guilt, and guilt meant confiscation, the ruin of his friends, and the end of the family as a Florentine power. So on the 7th of September, 1433, he climbed the palace stairs, and the guards closed around him, and they locked one of the richest private citizens in Europe in a cell in the bell tower, a cramped stone room the jailers called the Alberghetto, the little inn, with one small window looking down on the city. His money ran. Rinaldo wanted him dead, and legally, dead was available. The charge was assembled from the Lucca disaster and the standard accusation Florence kept on the shelf for men who rose too high, seeking to make himself greater than others. The crime of ambition itself. Conviction meant the axe. And here, in the tower, the ledger fought back. Cosimo spent 4 days refusing nearly all food, afraid of poison in the prison kitchen, until his jailer, a man named Federigo, agreed to share every dish, and the prisoner and his guard began eating together like traveling companions. Then the money started to move. The government's own records show the sequence. A payment found its way to the gonfaloniere of justice, the man chairing the proceedings. 1,000 florins by the account that stuck, and the family bragged afterward that he had sold Cosimo cheap, that 10 times the sum was there for the asking. The death sentence softened, day by purchased day, into a sentence of banishment. 10 years in Padua for Cosimo. Exile scattered across Italy for his brother and cousins. The Medici, formally stripped of political rights, finished as a force in the Republic. Rinaldo had won everything except the thing that mattered. He had the body out of the city. The network stayed, and so did the deposits. Because Cosimo, reading the weather months in advance, had quietly moved the bank's liquid capital out of Florence before the arrest, into the Venice branch, into monastery vaults, beyond the reach of any Florentine committee. The Republic had exiled a man. His money was already abroad, waiting for him, and money, unlike men, could not be arrested. What followed was the strangest exile in Italian memory. Padua and then Venice received Cosimo not as a disgraced convict, but as visiting royalty. The Venetian government sent a formal escort. Crowds turned out along the roads. Lords wrote letters of sympathy. And rulers who kept balances with the Medici Bank made their displeasure with Florence known through channels every merchant understood. Cosimo set up his desk and ran the bank from Venice, as if the move had been a business decision. And one contemporary marveled that never had any citizen, travelling in triumph, been honoured the way this banished man was honoured. Meanwhile, back home, the Albizzi discovered what Florence without Medici money actually felt like. Credit tightened. The war taxes still came due. The wool trade groaned. Deposits followed their owner north, and every squeezed merchant in the city knew exactly whose absence was squeezing him. The lottery finished the job. And there is a fine irony in that, because the lottery was the very machine the Albizzi had rigged for a generation. The leather bags still held names of men the vetting committees had passed in easier years. And, in the autumn of 1434, the drawing produced a signoria packed with friends of the Medici. The new government moved at once to recall the exile. Rinaldo, seeing the wheel turn, called his allies to arms and put several hundred armed men into the streets to overturn the government by force. And the coup collapsed into farce. Allied families hedged and stayed home. The Pope, of all people, was living in Florence that year, driven from Rome by a rising, and he summoned Rinaldo to Santa Maria Novella and talked at him for hours while the moment slipped away and the palace filled with defenders. The armed men drifted off to dinner. By nightfall, the revolt was over without a battle, and the Signoria, secure behind its walls, issued the decrees everyone now expected. Cosimo de' Medici was recalled. Rinaldo degli Albizzi and his allies got the exile they had written for others. And, unlike Cosimo, they would die in it on the 5th of October, 1434, 1 year and a month after climbing the stairs to a prison cell. Cosimo rode back into Florence through cheering streets, escorted to the palace like a returning prince, and slept that night, by his own account, in the palace itself as the government's guest. The Republic believed it had corrected an injustice done to a private citizen. It had actually held a coronation, and the man being crowned was the only person in the city who understood that no crown must ever appear. Start with the piece of testimony that ends every argument about who ruled Florence for the next 30 years. Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, a diplomat who dealt with every government in Italy and later sat on the papal throne as Pius II, described the city in plain words. Political questions are settled in Cosimo's house. He wrote, "The man he chooses holds office. He it is who decides peace and war. He is king in everything but name. In everything but name." Now watch how the trick was done. Because the machinery Cosimo built out of a republic's own parts is the reason this family ends up ruling the Renaissance. And none of it required changing a single word of the Constitution. He came home and took no title. There was no title to take. And that was fine. Because the Constitution itself was the weapon. Within weeks of the return, a specially convened emergency assembly granted extraordinary powers to reform the state. Standard procedure after an upheaval, and the reform touched exactly one thing that mattered: the leather bags. For years at a stretch, the lists of names eligible for the lottery were now curated by small boards of election officials. Accoppiatori, in the Florentine term, sometimes drawing by hand rather than by chance, and the boards were staffed by friends of the new order. The lottery still ran. The 2-month terms still turned over. Hundreds of citizens still cycled proudly through the palace, and the speeches about liberty went on exactly as before, but the vetting had changed hands. And the vetting was everything. The Albizzi had taught Cosimo the method by using it on him, and he repaid the lesson by perfecting it. Florence kept every ritual of a republic and lost the substance, and most Florentines, most of the time, could honestly tell themselves nothing had changed. For the citizens who saw through it, there were quieter instruments. The tax system in Florence assessed wealth partly through committees, and committees have discretion, and discretion has friends. A merchant who backed the wrong men found his declared assets scrutinized, his assessments creeping upward year by year, until the sensible course was silence or departure. No blood, no trials, no drama for the chroniclers, just arithmetic, patiently applied. Cosimo is supposed to have said that states are not held with prayer books, and whether or not the line is really his. The tax rolls of the era prove somebody in Florence believed it. Exile, the Republic's ancient blade, stayed available for hard cases, and the hard cases knew it. Most chose the arithmetic. Above the machinery floated the man, and the man's personal style was the most sophisticated piece of the entire system. Cosimo lived like a prosperous merchant, dressed like one, and moved through the city on foot with 1 or 2 companions. He kept his sons on mules instead of chargers. He stood godfather to the children of shopkeepers, attended guild dinners, and cultivated the small courtesies that cost nothing and bought everything. When his architect presented plans for a family palace so splendid it would have shamed most princes, Cosimo turned it down as too proud a thing to build. Envy is a plant one should never water, and hired a different architect for a design that was massive but severe. A fortress of plain brown stone, with all its luxury turned inward toward the courtyard, where the public could not see it. A visitor from any court in Europe would have walked past the richest household on the continent without a second glance. That was the point. Florence had killed and exiled men for looking like masters. It had no procedure at all for a master who looked like a citizen. His foreign policy ran on the same fuel as everything else. The bank. Here the story needs one name: Francesco Sforza, a mercenary general, the finest soldier in Italy, a peasant's grandson with an army for a family business and an eye on a throne. Cosimo picked him early, the way he picked investments, and the Medici Bank became Sforza's paymaster through years of campaigning. Enormous sums, secured by nothing but the general's prospects. Respectable Florence was appalled. The city's whole tradition loathed despots. And here was its leading citizen, bankrolling a warlord's climb. Cosimo paid the grumbling no attention. And in 1450, when Sforza's army took Milan and the general made himself its duke, the investment matured. Florence's ancient enemy, the great power that had menaced Tuscany for a century, was now governed by a man who owed his duchy to the Medici Bank, and the alliance between Florence and Milan became the axis of Italian politics. 4 years later, the exhausted powers signed a general settlement at Lodi, and Italy entered the longest stretch of peace it had known in living memory. A balance of 5 states: Milan, Venice, Florence, Rome, and Naples, leaning against each other like cards. Loans alone did not write that peace. But the alliance the peace rested on had been assembled in a loan book, and everyone negotiating at Lodi knew whose ledgers stood behind the Milanese signature. Cosimo had underwritten the stability of Italy the way he underwrote a wool shipment, and the return on investment was 40 years without a sack of Florence. Total the position at mid-century. A banker with no office controlled the elections, the taxes, the foreign policy, and the credit of a republic that still drew names from leather bags every 2 months and still gave speeches about liberty. And the arrangement was accepted, most of the time, by most of the city, because it visibly worked. Trade boomed, the florin held, the armies of Italy stayed off Tuscan wheat. Even men who despised the system conceded its results, and the results kept the lid on the furnace. One thing the system could not buy, and Cosimo knew it better than his flatterers did. All of it: the lists, the loans, Milan, the peace, hung on the credit of a single aging man. And credit is a rope of air. It holds because people believe it somewhere in the city, in the palace of some proud family, in the sermon of some fiery friar, in the resentment of some taxed and audited merchant. The belief was always one crisis away from failing. Cosimo had solved power. He had not solved permanence. And in his last years, he turned to the 2 projects that might outlive a banker's word. One was stone, the other was a grandson. In 1464, dying of gout in his darkened bedroom, Cosimo de' Medici ordered the doors of his palace opened, and for days the line of visitors stretched down the street. He had 2 obsessions at the end, and he made no secret of either. The first was the fate of his family after him. The second was the fate of his soul, and by the accounting he himself trusted most. His soul was in serious arrears. That fear had a paper trail, and the paper trail explains a large part of what the modern world calls the Renaissance. Years earlier, Cosimo had gone to Pope Eugenius, the same pope who owed him money and shelter, and confessed the anxiety that stalked every banker of the age. His fortune was built on lending, and lending was usury, and usury was the sand of the 7th circle. The Pope's response survives in its consequences. Cosimo could balance the account, Eugenius indicated, by spending on God what he had made on interest, and the specific invoice attached was a ruined convent on the north side of Florence called San Marco. Cosimo took the deal the way he took every deal. Thoroughly. He rebuilt San Marco from the ground up. Cloisters, library, cells, altarpiece, at a cost his own family put at more than 30,000 florins, a sum that would have ransomed a prince. His favorite painter, a friar named Fra Angelico, frescoed the walls until the whole building glowed like a prayer. And, in the corner of the convent, Cosimo kept a private cell for himself, bar as a monk's, where the richest man in Florence could sit alone with accounts of a different kind. He told a friend exactly what the project was. God, he said, had only to wait a little while, and the books would show a profit in his favor. Hold on to how strange and how honest that sentence is. Because it was no metaphor to Cosimo. It was refinancing. He was moving wealth from the damned column to the saved column. Entry by entry. Buildings for interest. Altars for exchange fees. And the transaction ran through the only institution authorized to certify the transfer. The church, his bank, already serviced. Once you see that engine, you see it everywhere in Florence. The sacristy his father began at San Lorenzo, finished and expanded until the family's parish church became a Medici mausoleum in all but name, the novices' quarters at Santa Croce, the rebuilt Badia at Fiesole, commissions flowing to Donatello, whom Cosimo loved personally and kept in work, by one account, so the aging sculptor would never feel poverty. Contemporaries did the math with their mouths open. One estimate from inside the family circle put Cosimo's lifetime spending on buildings, charity, and taxes at more than 600,000 florins. And when someone marveled at the sum, Cosimo answered that he never gave the city anything except that it was also giving to himself. That second half of the sentence is the other piston of the engine, and it fired on pure politics. Every construction site was a payroll. Hundreds of masons, carpenters, carvers, and haulers drawing Medici wages year after year. An entire economy of gratitude in a city where gratitude voted. Every convent rebuilt made an order of friars into a pulpit friendly to the family name. And pulpits were the mass media of the 15th century. Every association between Medici and magnificence made the family harder to remove, because tearing them down now meant tearing at the city's own beauty, its own pride, its own skyline. And above that skyline, literally, stood the era's crowning proof of what Florentine money and Florentine nerve could do together. The Cathedral of Florence had gaped unfinished for a generation, its crossing open to the rain, because nobody on earth knew how to build a dome 140 feet across without forests of scaffolding the city could not afford. A hot-tempered goldsmith named Filippo Brunelleschi solved it. Ring by herringbone, ring of brick, a machine of a building rising without visible support. The dome was no Medici commission. It belonged to the cathedral works, the Wool Guild, and the Republic, and it rose over a Florence in which Medici wealth and Medici influence were becoming harder to separate from the city's public life with every passing year. When the lantern was consecrated, the Pope himself performed the ceremony. In the years when the Pope was Florence's guest and the Medici Bank was his wallet, the dome belonged to God and the Republic. Every Florentine also understood whose era it crowned. And then there were the books, the project that pointed furthest past his own lifetime. Cosimo had caught the manuscript fever early. In the years when scholars were shaking Europe's monastery libraries for the lost classics of Greece and Rome, and he spent on parchment with the same seriousness he spent on stone. He funded the book hunters. He kept teams of copyists working, 45 scribes at one stretch, by the count of his own bookseller, producing 200 volumes in under 2 years for the Fiesole Library. He gave collections away, and the collection he installed at San Marco, catalogued and opened to scholars, is remembered as the first public library in Europe since the ancient world. When a Greek delegation came west for a great church council, Cosimo maneuvered the council itself to Florence, bank underwriting the expenses, and the city filled with Byzantine scholars whose lectures on Plato lit a fire in Florentine minds that never went out. Before he died, Cosimo settled a villa and an income on a young scholar named Marsilio Ficino with one instruction: translate Plato, all of it, into Latin, and Ficino was still at the work decades later. None of this was decoration. A city that saw itself as the new Athens saw the Medici as the reason it could, and a family wrapped in that identity had achieved something no constitution could strip by vote. He died on the 1st of August, 1464, at his villa outside the city, 74 years old. Having instructed his sons to bury him without pomp, the funeral was plain, as ordered, and the whole city walked in it anyway. Then the government of the Republic did something it had never done for any citizen. By public decree, carved onto his tomb slab before the high altar of San Lorenzo, Florence named him Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. The title the ancient Romans had voted to Cicero for saving the Republic. Every literate Florentine could taste the irony. The Republic's highest honor, borrowed from the history of liberty itself, awarded by free vote to the man who had quietly ended free voting, and meant sincerely by thousands who mourned him. No conqueror ever managed anything close. Cosimo had made a city love its own capture. What he left was a system disguised as a family. And a family, at that moment, in trouble. His capable younger son was dead within months of him. The bank's steadiest managerial hand was gone. The heir to the lists, the loans, the alliance with Milan, and the invisible throne was the surviving son, a man of 50 whose body was already failing him so badly that Florentines, with their genius for cruel nicknames, knew him by his disease. Piero the Gouty was about to learn what happens to an unofficial crown when the men who tolerated the father decide the son is weak enough to take. The plotters gave themselves a name with a view in it. They met on the high ground of Florence, in the palaces above the river, and called themselves the Party of the Hill, which made Piero the Medici, down in his sickbed in the family palace. The Party of the Plain, the low ground, the easy target. History remembers them by the grander title their leader craved, and their leader was the richest man in Florence after the Medici themselves, Luca Pitti, a vine-hungry magnate who had begun building himself a palace across the river so colossal that its windows, he liked to boast, would be larger than the doors of the Medici house. With him stood men of weight. Dio ti salvi, Neroni, a trusted family adviser turning his coat, Niccolo Soderini, a genuine Republican who wanted the leather bags honest again, and Agnolo Acciaiuoli, old aristocracy with old grudges. Their opening assumption was reasonable. The father had been unbeatable. The son was a sick clerk. Push him. And the whole Medici arrangement, lists, loans, and legend, would fold like paper. The son gave them their opening. or seemed to, taking over the bank. Piero found the books swollen with soft loans. Political credit his father had extended for influence rather than profit, and on advice. The story goes, of the same Neroni now plotting against him. He began calling some of it in a city living on credit. The tightening hurt. Businesses stumbled, and every merchant it pinched became a listener for the party of the hill. The chroniclers close to the family later softened the episode, and chroniclers close to the plotters sharpened it. So treat the details with care. What no one disputes is the mood it fed. By the summer of 1466, Florence was full of men saying out loud that the Medici moment had passed with the old man, and the conspirators had moved from talk to timetable. Soderini pressed for politics. Win the Signoria. Restore open elections. And let the Constitution do the killing. Others wanted certainty. Mercenary contacts were sounded. The Lord of Ferrara agreed to move troops toward the border. Somewhere in the discussions, the plan acquired its sharpest edge, and the sharpest edge was aimed at a road. In late August, Piero lay sick at the family villa at Careggi. Outside the walls, word reached him. Through the listening network his father had spent 40 years wiring into the region, that armed men were posted on the main road back to Florence, and that the plan was to finish the Medici problem at a bend in the highway. No trial, no politics. A sick man in a litter and a quick afternoon's work. What happened next became the family's favorite story about its own future. And for once the story is anchored in sober accounts. Piero sent his 17-year-old son ahead down the main road. Mounted, visible, a decoy with instructions to see and be seen. The boy rode into the trap's outer edge. Read the loiterers for what they were. Sent a servant doubling back to swing his father's party onto a side road. And then, by the account that stuck, chatted his way past the ambush with the unbothered charm of a teenager on an errand, buying with small talk the minutes his father needed. Piero came home to Florence alive by the back way. The boy's name was Lorenzo, and Florence would spend the next 30 years learning what else he could improvise. The coup was now a race, and the invalid won it going away. Piero, immobilized by gout, ran the counterstroke from a bed in the palace, and the city watched a masterclass in what the Medici machine actually was when the pleasantries came off. Money moved. Sforza cavalry from Milan. The alliance his father had bought with a decade of loans started south before the plotters Ferrarese troops could position. The palace filled with armed friends. The approaches to the city were watched. And grain, in a touch the popular quarters appreciated, was laid in against trouble. The conspirators had a head start, a cause, and 3,000 men marching for them. And they hesitated anyway, because the one thing they had never settled was who among them would rule the day after. And every hour of hesitation let more of Florence calculate the odds. The calculation ended it. A new signoria favourable to the Medici took office. The militia answered the palace, and the party of the hill dissolved without a battle, exactly as the Albizzi coup had dissolved 32 years before. Ambition, defeated by arithmetic. The endgame told the city, who had really learned from Cosimo. Piero summoned Luca Pitti, the ringleader, the man whose windows were to outshine Medici doors, and instead of destroying him, forgave him. A marriage was even dangled between the families. Pitti walked out of the palace alive, pardoned, and politically dead, because a plotter publicly spared by his intended victim, is a plotter no one will ever follow again. He wandered the city for the rest of his life, avoided and mocked. His giant palace stalled unfinished for lack of money and friends, and the stone shell across the river stood for years as Florence's favorite lesson in how the Medici handled enemies. The lesson had a second panel. The plotters, who had actually put steel on the road, Neroni, Soderini, Acciaiuoli, got exile. And when Soderini kept conspiring abroad and helped talk Venice into war against Florence the following year, the Republic's army met the invasion at the border and turned it back. Mercy for the broken, banishment for the dangerous, war for the incorrigible. Each measured to the man. A sick clerk had graded the entire opposition in a single autumn. Piero lived 3 more years, ran the state from his bed, patched the bank, and staged one more piece of theatre that showed he understood the family business in full. In 1469 he mounted a tournament in the great piazza, ostensibly a chivalric festival, actually a debut. Lorenzo, 20 years old, rode as the star in silks stitched with pearls, carrying a banner painted by Verrocchio with a motto in French, Le temps revient, the time returns. The good age comes again. The crowd roared. The poets wrote, and the message landed in every quarter of the city. The dynasty had a face again, and the face was young. That December, Piero died quietly at home, and the leading men of Florence did something that had now happened twice in a row, which in politics makes it a system. They walked to the Medici palace. No lottery, no law, no title on offer, and asked a 20-year-old banker to take charge of the Republic. Lorenzo wrote down his own account of that visit years later, and his summary of why he said yes deserves to close the chapter, because it is the whole Medici arrangement confessed in one line by its most gifted operator. I consented to it unwillingly, he wrote, and only to protect our friends and our fortune. For in Florence, one can ill live in the possession of wealth without control of the government. Every portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici agrees on one thing, and it is the thing no court painter would ever have dared invent. He was ugly. The nose was long and flattened, and it had no sense of smell at all. The jaw jutted. The voice came out high and harsh, a strange nasal instrument from such a heavy frame, and he could not sing a note, which mattered. In a man who wrote songs half of Florence ended up singing. He was also, by the testimony of nearly everyone who met him, the most magnetic human being in Italy. And the gap between the face and the effect is the best short introduction to his kind of power. Nothing about Lorenzo worked on paper. Everything about him worked in the room. He had been built for the job, the way racehorses are built, deliberately, over 20 years. His mother, Lucrezia Tornabuoni, was a serious poet and a shrewder political operator than most of the men her husband dealt with, and she ran the household that raised him. His tutors were the stars of Ficino's Platonic circle. So the boy learned Greek philosophy at the dinner table and diplomacy on the road, sent as a teenager to charm the Pope in Rome, the King in Naples, the Duke in Milan. Missions with real stakes carried on adolescent shoulders. By the time the leading men walked to the palace in December of 1469 and asked him to take charge of the state, he had already run a covert political errand or two, dodged an ambush on the Careggi road, and starred in his own propaganda festival. 20 years old, and the most trained ruler of his generation. in a city that still swore it had no rulers. His grandfather had walked to the market in brown cloth and refused a palace too proud. Lorenzo kept the constitutional camouflage, the lists, the friendly committees, the councils stacked deep with clients, and dropped the personal disguise entirely. And the timing tells you why. Cosimo had needed to prove the Medici were not princes. Lorenzo needed to prove Florence was not a second-rate power. And in the Italy of the 1470s, a state advertised its weight through the splendor of its leading man. So the splendor came. He bought and bred the finest horses in Italy and won races across the peninsula. He hunted with falcons, collected ancient gems and vases worth more than paintings, and filled the palace with scholars who dined at his table as equals. He married, and the marriage broke a century of family practice in a single stroke. Every previous Medici bride had been Florentine, a thread binding the family to the city's merchant class. Lorenzo married Clarice Orsini, a Roman aristocrat from a clan of warlords and cardinals, a bride his mother inspected in Rome like a diplomatic treaty, which is what she was. Republican Florence noticed exactly what the match meant, that the Medici were now marrying at the level of princes, and grumbled, and attended the wedding festivities anyway. 5 days of them, with banquets for thousands, and, he wrote, this part sits so strangely on a banker prince that historians keep checking it and finding it real. Lorenzo is a genuine figure in the history of Italian literature, a poet of the first rank in his generation, and his range ran from Platonic love sonnets to drinking songs for the carnival crowds. Lyrics composed for the masked processions, his own festivals sent dancing through the streets. The most famous verse he ever wrote is a carnival song about youth, and its refrain became the closest thing the Florentine Golden Age has to a motto. How beautiful is youth! It runs, which flees from us always. Let whoever wants to be happy now. Of tomorrow there is no certainty. The whole Medici century is folded into those lines. The sweetness, the spending, the shadow. A man who kept the books his family kept knew precisely how little tomorrow was promised, and chose to set the knowledge to music and hand it to the crowd as a dance. The patronage changed shape with him, and the change is worth being precise about, because the legend gets it lazily wrong. Lorenzo commissioned far less than his grandfather. The colossal building programs slowed, partly because the point had been made in stone already, partly because the money was quietly no longer there. What Lorenzo ran instead was something closer to a talent agency for the whole peninsula. He spotted ability early, trained it up in the workshops he favored, and then placed it, deliberately, in the courts of the men he needed to manage. A gifted young painter or sculptor sent from Florence to Milan, to Rome, to Naples, was a gift no duke could refuse, and a Florentine agent installed at a rival's elbow. Softening policy, gathering talk, spreading the gospel that Florence was the fountain of everything beautiful. Verrocchio's workshop supplied the pipeline. Botticelli painted for the family circle, and in 1482, Lorenzo sent Milan a package containing a lute player of unusual promise named Leonardo da Vinci. In the sculpture garden near San Marco, where he kept his antiquities under the eye of an old Donatello pupil, his people found a stonecutter's son of about 15 with a gift that stopped conversation, and Lorenzo took the boy into the palace itself and raised him at the family table beside his own sons. The boy was Michelangelo. Power in Lorenzo's hands, had learned to reproduce itself through beauty. And the beauty was doing state work every hour of every day. Beneath the shine, the two load-bearing walls of his inheritance were both cracking, and Lorenzo knew about one of them. The bank was sliding. The general manager Sassetti let the branch partners run long leashes, and the branches repaid the trust with disasters. London sunk in unrecoverable loans to a king fighting a civil war. Bruges bleeding out through loans to the Duke of Burgundy that violated every rule old Cosimo ever wrote. Lorenzo was many brilliant things, and a banker was never one of them. He had been trained for rule, and the ledgers bored him, and the men he delegated them to told him comfortable things. The other crack he made himself. In 1472, the subject town of Volterra quarrelled with Florence over a mineral concession. Alum, the dye-fixing rock the wool trade ran on, and Lorenzo, against senior advice, shows force. The mercenary army sent to accept the town's surrender got out of hand, or was let out of hand, and sacked it, killing and looting through streets that had already yielded. Lorenzo rode to Volterra afterward with money and apologies, and the money changed nothing that mattered. Italy had seen the smiling young man's other face, and taken notes. The sharpest note-taker sat in Rome. In 1471, the papal throne passed to Francesco della Rovere, Pope Sixtus IV, a Franciscan scholar from nothing, whose piety stopped precisely at the border of his family ambitions, which were bottomless. He came in friendly. He renewed the Medici bank's papal business, received Lorenzo warmly, and sold him rare stones from the papal collection. Then he began carving Italy for his nephews, and one nephew in particular, a crude, hungry soldier named Girolamo Riario, needed a state to rule, and the state on offer sat in the Romagna, on the road between papal territory and Florentine territory, exactly where Florence could least afford an ambitious neighbour. The Pope needed 40,000 ducats to buy the town of Imola for this nephew, and he sent the invoice. Naturally, to his bankers, Lorenzo looked at the request, understood exactly what it would build on his border, and made the first move in the deadliest game of his life. He stalled. He pleaded difficulties. He quietly warned other Florentine banks to keep their vaults shut. And the second oldest banking family in Florence, a proud, ancient house of the old aristocracy, watching the papal account dangle, saw the chance of a century. The Papacy lent the Pope his 40,000 ducats. Sixtus got Imola. Riario got his state. The Papacy got the papal business. And Lorenzo got an enemy inside the walls and an enemy on the throne of St. Peter, joined now by money and grievance. The bank had made the Medici. The bank was about to try to kill them. The Papacy were older than the Medici in every way that Florence pretended to care about. Their ancestor had gone on the First Crusade and brought home flints from the Holy Sepulchre that still lit the city's Easter fire every year. They banked at the level of kings, married into the best blood in Italy, and had spent 2 generations watching a family of upstart wool country loan clerks run the Republic through committees, while Papacy men bowed at Medici weddings. One of those weddings was their own. Lorenzo's sister Bianca was married to Guglielmo de Pazzi, which put the two houses at the same table every Sunday and changed nothing underneath. When the Imola loan blew the rivalry into the open, Lorenzo answered with the quiet tools, and the quiet tools were a mistake he would pay for in blood. A law reshuffled inheritance rules in a way that stripped a fortune from a Patsy wife's family claim. Patsy men found public careers stalling, honors drying up, doors closing softly all over the city. Old Cosimo had always left a beaten rival, a dignified exit. Lorenzo, 30 years younger and surer of himself, left the proudest family in Florence rich, humiliated, and cornered. And a cornered aristocrat with money is the most dangerous animal in Renaissance Italy. The conspiracy assembled itself in Rome, in the orbit of the Pope's nephew. Through the summer and autumn of 1477, Girolamo Riario wanted the Medici gone because Florence blocked his ambitions in the Romagna. Francesco de' Pazzi, the family's Rome branch manager, a small, intense, furious man, wanted them gone for reasons he could recite in his sleep. The third principal wore an archbishop's robes. Francesco Salviati had been named Archbishop of Pisa, in Florentine territory, without Florentine consent, and Lorenzo had answered the insult by barring him from his own cathedral city for 3 years, an injury the archbishop had nursed into a vocation. Around this core gathered the professionals, and the most important of them was a mercenary captain in papal service named Giovan Battista da Montesecco, hired to handle the killing, who did something none of the gentlemen conspirators bothered to do. He asked questions. He travelled to Florence, met Lorenzo on business pretexts, took the measure of the city, and came back with a professional's report. The Medici were not hated. He warned. The people stood with them. Kill the brothers, and Florence might not rise for the killers at all. The gentlemen heard him out and went on planning, because grievance had done their arithmetic for them. And above the whole enterprise, in the papal apartments, the plot received its strangest blessing. Montesecco's own confession, made later under interrogation and preserved by the Florentine government, records the conversation. Sixtus wanted the government of Florence changed, wanted Lorenzo removed, and repeated to the plotters that he desired no killing. The room understood what such words meant from a pope who then armed the operation, blessed its participants, and kept a nephew at its head. Sixtus would take the outcome and keep his conscience. The plan required both brothers dead in the same hour, Lorenzo and Giuliano, because either one alive meant the network survived with a head. And through the spring of 1478, the conspirators chased the two of them like a pair of moving targets. Bonche by Bonche, a young cardinal, a Riario grandnephew, was paraded to Florence as bait, since his visits obliged the Medici to host. Twice the setting failed. Once, because Giuliano skipped the dinner, the final date fixed itself. On Sunday, the 26th of April, the cardinal would attend High Mass at the cathedral, under Brunelleschi's dome, and both brothers would have to be there, standing in fixed places, in a packed church, at a moment in the liturgy known to the minute. It was Montesecco who refused the upgrade. He would kill Lorenzo at a table or on a road, he said, but he would not add sacrilege to murder and cut a man down in front of the consecrated host. With God watching, the gentleman found substitutes, and the substitutes tell you what the plot had become. 2 priests took the contract, one of them carrying a grudge from Volterra. Men of God stepped in to do the thing. The mercenary assassin refused. In the house of God, at the elevation of the host, when every head in Florence would be bowed, the Mass began before a congregation in the thousands, the cardinal glittering at the altar, the brothers separated in the crowd. which forced the killers to split into two teams. At the appointed instant of the liturgy, with the bell sounding and the crowd's eyes down, Bernardo Bandini and Francesco de Pazzi turned on Giuliano de' Medici. Bandini's first blow split his skull, and Francesco fell on the young man on the pavement in a frenzy so total that he drove his dagger through his own thigh, and they left Giuliano with 19 wounds. Dead at 25 on the cathedral floor. A few yards away, the operation failed by inches. The two priests were amateurs, and a hand on the shoulder to steady the strike gave Lorenzo a half-second of warning. He spun away with the blade already moving, took a gash across the neck, wrapped his cloak around one arm as a shield, and vaulted the low choir rail with his friends closing around him. One of them, Francesco Nori, taking a killing thrust meant for his master, the poet Poliziano, in the group that ran, remembered the next seconds all his life. They dragged Lorenzo through the choir, past the altar, into the north sacristy, and swung the heavy bronze doors shut on the chaos. And, inside, with the crowd's roar coming through the metal, a companion sucked Lorenzo's wound clean with his own mouth in case the blades had been poisoned. The cathedral emptied in a screaming stampede under the largest dome in the world. The cardinal clung to the altar. White as the marble, everything now depended on the second half of the plan. And the second half was already dying. Archbishop Salviati had gone to seize the Palazzo della Signoria with a troop of Perugian mercenaries, counting on surprise and the 2-month amateurs of the Republic's government folding at the sight of steel. He talked his way in to see the gonfaloniere, Cesare Petrucci, a man who happened to have survived a coup attempt in a previous posting and knew the smell. Salviati stammered through a fake papal message, his eyes sliding to the door where his men should have been, and Petrucci read him in one look, bellowed for the guard, and physically grappled the Archbishop's confederates himself, by one account seizing a man by the hair. The mercenaries, following behind, had let a door click shut on a latch none of them knew, and locked themselves into the chancery. The bell of the palace began to toll the emergency, and Florence poured into the streets to answer a question the conspirators had bet everything on, and had bet wrong. Old Jacopo de Pazzi, head of the house, rode into the piazza with 100 armed men shouting the ancient cry of Florentine revolution, people and liberty. The crowd answered him with stones from the windows and a counter-roar that settled the day and the century. Palle, palle, the balls, the balls, the red balls of the Medici coat of arms turned into a war cry by the mob the plotters had claimed to be liberating. Montesecco had been right about everything. By afternoon the piazza was a gallows. The mercenaries trapped in the chancery were killed and thrown from the windows. Francesco de Pazzi, dragged from his family palace, still bleeding from his own dagger stroke, was hanged naked from a window of the government palace, and beside him, in full episcopal vestments, the Republic hanged the Archbishop of Pisa, and the crowd swore afterward that Salviati, swinging, had fixed his teeth into the corpse beside him. Jacopo fled the city, was caught in the hills, brought back, tortured, and hanged from the same window. The city was not finished with him even then. Weeks later, a mob dug the old man out of his grave, dragged the corpse through the streets by the noose, still on its neck, propped it at the door of the Pazzi palace to knock. So the joke ran, and finally threw it in the Arno, where boys fished it out downstream, flogged it, and threw it back. Roughly 80 people died in the days of vengeance. Some guilty, some convenient. Montesecco, the assassin with the working conscience, gave the interrogators the full confession that survives, Pope and all, and was granted a soldier's beheading. The two priests were mutilated by the mob before the authorities got them to a gallows. Bandini, Giuliano's first killer, got the farthest all the way to Constantinople, and the reach of the Medici network wrote its own ending to the story. The Sultan himself had the fugitive arrested and shipped home in chains as a courtesy between governments. And in December of 1479, Florence hanged him from a palace window in the Turkish clothes he was captured in. A young artist stood in the crowd beneath the body with a notebook, recorded the costume in a neat professional sketch. Turquoise jacket, blue hose, and added the hanged man's name. The artist was Leonardo da Vinci, the government's ledger. Meanwhile, recorded a payment of 40 gold florins to Sandro Botticelli for the mural above the customs house door. The conspirators painted hanging in effigy at the scene of their crime, with verses under each figure composed by Lorenzo himself. The Papacy name was legally abolished, their palace seized, their emblem chiseled off the walls of Florence. Every man of the line banned from office forever, and citizens married to Papacy, women disqualified alongside them. Giuliano was buried before a weeping city, and it came out in time that a girl of the Guarini family had borne him a son shortly before or after his death, a baby named Giulio, whom Lorenzo took into the palace and raised as his own. File that name away. The orphan of the Papacy conspiracy will wear the papal crown one day, and preside over the second great catastrophe of this story. Lorenzo had survived the blades, buried his brother, and watched his city hang his enemies from government windows. 20 miles south, the news reached Rome, and Sixtus IV, informed that his conspiracy had failed. His archbishop had been hanged in his vestments, and a cardinal had been detained by a mob, reached for weapons no banker had ever faced. Excommunication for Lorenzo. Interdict for Florence. Every church closed. Every sacrament suspended. A whole city's souls held hostage. And behind the spiritual artillery, the armies of the Papacy and the Kingdom of Naples, mobilizing for a war whose stated objective was one man, alive or otherwise. The Pope had failed to kill Lorenzo in church. He now proposed to do it in the open. And this time, the whole map of Italy was the weapon. The war that followed the hangings was fought over a single human being, and the paperwork said so. Pope Sixtus announced that his quarrel was with Lorenzo de' Medici alone, that Florence could have peace, absolution, and open churches on any morning it cared to name. The price was one man, delivered to Rome. The Republic's answer came back with the speed of genuine anger. The government, the councils, even the Florentine clergy, who gathered in synod and drafted a blistering reply to the interdict, stood behind their leading citizen, and one bishop's letter to the Pope caught the city's mood in a phrase that still lands after 5 centuries. You call Lorenzo a tyrant. The argument ran. Yet the assassins found the whole city ready to die for him. Florence kept its churches open in defiance of the ban, ordered its priests to say Mass anyway, and settled in for war against the Vicar of Christ and the largest kingdom in Italy. The war itself went the way wars go for merchant republics that rent their soldiers. Florence hired condottieri, and the condottieri did what their profession did best, which was maneuver handsomely, skirmish carefully, and survive to invoice another season. The Papal and Neapolitan armies under Federico de Montefeltro, the mercenary duke whose broken-nosed portrait hangs in the Uffizi today, ground forward through the Chiana Valley. Towns fell. The countryside burned within sight of Florentine hills. By the autumn of 1479, after a sharp defeat at Poggio Imperiale sent refugees streaming up the roads to the city, Florence was losing, and losing in the way that mattered most to a state built on commerce. Trade was strangled. The interdict poisoned business in every Catholic market. War taxes bled the guilds white, and plague, which followed armies the way gulls follow ships, was working through Tuscany. The city had rallied around Lorenzo out of fury at the murder of Giuliano. 2 years of defeat, embargo, and funerals were spending that fury down to the bottom of the account. And Lorenzo, reading the city's mood through his network, the way his grandfather had taught the family to read everything, understood that one more losing campaign season would finish him without any assassin's help. Sixtus would get his one man, delivered not by soldiers but by an exhausted Florence itself. So in the first week of December, 1479, Lorenzo did the thing that made him a legend in his own lifetime, and he staged it with a showman's care. He left Florence quietly with a small party, and only from the road did he send his explanation back to the government, a letter designed to be read aloud and copied, which it was. Since he was the person his enemies claimed to want, he wrote, perhaps delivering himself was the cure. All the troubles had fallen on Florence because of him, and so he would place his own life in the balance, because he desired nothing more than the good of his city, and perhaps God willed that the war which began in his brother's blood should end by his hand. Then he rode to the coast and took ship for Naples, into the port of the king whose armies were burning Tuscany, the king whose name was attached to the war aimed at his head. Every history of the Medici pauses here, and it should. So let the pause be honest about what he was actually doing. The gesture looked like surrender. A man walking unarmed into the enemy's palace. The reality underneath had been engineered for months. Lorenzo had been in secret correspondence with Naples through intermediaries long before he sailed, testing the water, and he knew things about his host that made the gamble a calculation rather than a miracle. King Ferrante of Naples was a monster of the first rank, even by the standards of the age. A man whose enemies had a way of dying in his prisons, and gossip that reached as far as the French court claimed he kept his defeated foes closer still, preserved after death. A private museum of the people who had crossed him. The stories may have grown in the telling. What was undeniable was that this was a king who could hold Lorenzo, sell him to Rome, or bury him, and no power on earth could object effectively. But Ferrante was also a calculator, and Lorenzo came to Naples carrying arguments aimed precisely at a calculator's mind. A Florence broken and swallowed by the Pope's family would become a Riario state on the flank of Neapolitan interests, and every ducat of new papal strength was a ducat aimed eventually at Naples. Because popes and Neapolitan kings had been wrestling over Italy for 2 centuries. Sixtus was old. His nephews were greedy. Did Ferrante really want to spend Neapolitan blood and treasure to make the Della Rovere family the masters of central Italy? The visit lasted 10 weeks, and Lorenzo ran it like a season-long performance for an audience of 1. He spent money through Naples with both hands, dowering poor girls, ransoming Christian galley slaves, banqueting the nobility, charming the king's terrifying family, being visibly, expensively unafraid. The Neapolitan court, which had expected a trembling supplicant, found itself hosting the most interesting man in Italy, and the citizenry took to him, through it all, the negotiation ground on, stalling and restarting, because Ferrante was constitutionally incapable of not squeezing a guest whose life he held. There were weeks when the talks froze, and the whole gamble looked lost. And Lorenzo, by the accounts closest to the events, kept his nerve and kept spending. In February, the king finally chose. Naples signed a separate peace with Florence, on terms that cost the Republic some border fortresses and payments dressed up in diplomatic lace, and cut the Pope's war off at the knees. Sixtus raged at the betrayal, raged at Ferrante, raged at the world, and then discovered within months that he needed every soldier he had, because in August of 1480, an Ottoman force landed at Otranto on the Neapolitan coast, stormed the town, and killed or enslaved most of its population. Italy's quarrels went silent in a single, shocked breath. The Pope needed unity, needed Naples, needed even Florence, and the price of absolution collapsed. A Florentine delegation performed a carefully choreographed penance at the doors of St. Peter's. The interdict was lifted, and the war that had been declared to destroy one banker ended with the banker sailing home. He returned in March of 1480 to a city that met him at the gates as something more than a citizen. He had gone into the monster's palace carrying nothing and come back carrying peace. And Florence, which had spent 2 years paying for his survival, decided the payment had bought a treasure. The word his own generation attached to him hardened into a title around this time. Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. And it is worth knowing that the word began as ordinary Italian courtesy for any great citizen, an honorific like Excellency. Florence made it a name, his name, and no one else's. Because after Naples, no one else was in the running, and here the chapter has to turn its cards over. Because the man who came home to the cheering was done taking chances with the Republic's affections. Within weeks of his return, while the gratitude was at flood tide, a hand-picked emergency committee reformed the Constitution one more time, and out of the reform came a new body, the Council of 70, members chosen for life, packed with Medici men, holding effective control over legislation, elections, and war. The old camouflage of 2-month terms and leather bags remained standing out front, the way a historic facade is left on a rebuilt building. Behind it, Florence was now governed by a permanent committee of the Medici party, and the change drew barely a protest, because the city had just finished demonstrating, at the top of its lungs, that it preferred Lorenzo to liberty. His grandfather had ruled by never letting Florence feel the hand. Lorenzo, after the knives and the war, ruled by a hand the city could feel and had decided it wanted there. It is the quietest turning point in the whole story. The invisible throne now had a waiting list, a membership roll, and a lifetime term. The dozen years that followed Naples became the time that Florence would spend the next 3 centuries homesick for, and the homesickness started before the era was even over. The peninsula settled into balance, and the balance had a keeper. Ambassadors' reports from the 1480s show the leaders of Italy routing their quarrels through the palace on the Via Larga. Milan and Naples glaring at each other through Florentine mediation. Popes, measured and managed. Crises talked down before they became campaigns. The image that stuck to Lorenzo in these years, the needle of the Italian compass, was coined by men who watched him work. And for once, the flattery described a real function. Italy, in the 1480s, was 5 armed states leaning against each other, and the man keeping the lean from becoming a collapse was a private citizen in a republic, holding no office, commanding no army, armed with a network, a reputation, and a genius for the personal letter. At home, the golden age was a texture, a feel in the streets that survivors described for the rest of their lives. Carnival roared through the city with floats and torchlight and Lorenzo's own songs in the processions. Ficino held forth on Plato at the villa gatherings. Pico della Mirandola arrived with his impossible learning and his plan to reconcile every philosophy on earth. Poliziano wrote verse that scholars still rank with anything in the language, and Botticelli painted for the family circle the mythologies that would one day hang in the Uffizi as the very definition of the word Renaissance. In the sculpture garden by San Marco, the teenage Michelangelo carved his first marbles under Lorenzo's roof, ate at Lorenzo's table, and absorbed the household's Platonism so deeply that 80 years later, dying in Rome, he was still working out its arguments in stone. Even the countryside got its share, villas rising on the hills. And at Poggio, Acciano Lorenzo built himself a retreat with a Greek temple front, the first of its kind, the country house of a philosopher king, who officially was neither. Now open the books, because underneath the shine, the machine that paid for everything was failing, and the failure was the one problem in Italy that Lorenzo could not charm. The Medici Bank in the 1480s was a wreck, travelling on reputation. The great branches that Cosimo had run like a fleet were sinking one by one. London had drowned in loans to the English crown during its civil wars. Debts a king could simply decline to repay, and the branch died, owing more than it could ever collect. Bruges had been gutted the same way, its manager violating old Cosimo's iron rule against lending big to princes, because princes borrow like lords and repay like weather. Milan closed. Avignon withered. The Rome branch, the ancient engine of the fortune, had lost the papal account in the feud with Sixtus and never fully recovered its old primacy. Lyon struggled through mismanagement and worse. Behind all the individual disasters lay the structural one, which was that the man at the top was a statesman and a poet running what his great-grandfather had built as a bank. Lorenzo did not love the work, did not watch the managers, and trusted the general manager Sassetti, who trusted the branch partners, who trusted their own optimism. Audits that should have happened yearly happened rarely. Capital that should have been rebuilt was spent, and spent partly on the very magnificence that made the political system run. The festivals, the gifts, the diplomacy, the talent agency, the whole glittering apparatus of soft power that kept Florence safe and the Medici loved. The fortune and the state had been fused into a single instrument for 3 generations. Now the instrument was consuming itself, and the fusion meant that a banking collapse would be a constitutional crisis. How Lorenzo bridged the widening gap is the darkest entry in his ledger, and the sources let us see just enough to know it was dark. Money moved into Medici accounts from the dowry fund of the commune, the public trust where Florentine fathers deposited savings for their daughters' marriages, and repayments to families came slow, or short, or in paper. Money moved from the estate of young cousins Lorenzo held in guardianship, tens of thousands of florins that the cousins, grown, would pursue with a lifelong bitterness that history should remember when those cousins reappear later in this story under the flag of the family's enemies. The state's own finances and the family's finances, always intimate, now blurred past the point where any auditor could honestly separate them. Apologists then and since have argued the traffic ran both ways across that blur, that Lorenzo had spent his family's fortune on the Republic's safety for decades, and the Republic owed him the difference. The argument has real force. It is also exactly the argument every ruler in history has used when reaching into a public till. And Florence's Republicans would one day read the accounts and reach their own verdict. Rome, meanwhile, had changed keepers. Sixtus died in 1484, raging to the end, and the new pope, Innocent VIII, was a mild, pliable man whom Lorenzo cultivated with 20 years of accumulated skill. Letters flowed south, favors flowed both ways, and the friendship matured into the two transactions that shaped everything after. In 1488, Lorenzo's daughter, Maddalena, married the Pope's son, a dissolute middle-aged man, acknowledged with a shrug by a pontiff who had fathered him openly before taking orders. The price of the match ran the other direction, and the price was the future. Lorenzo wanted a cardinal's hat for his second son, Giovanni, a plump, clever, cheerful boy destined from the nursery for the church. The Pope resisted, because the boy was a child, and Lorenzo pressed with every instrument he owned. And in 1489, Innocent yielded. Giovanni de' Medici received the red hat at 13, on the condition that the appointment stay secret for 3 years, while the boy studied canon law at Pisa, a fig leaf of decency covering what everyone understood was the naked purchase of the church's highest rank for a banker's child. In March of 1492, the 3 years expired, and Florence threw a festival as its own son, 16 years old, was invested in state as a prince of the church and rode south to Rome. Lorenzo, too sick to attend the ceremonies, wrote his boy a long letter of advice that survives. Worldly, tender, and clear-eyed about the sewer the boy was entering. Rome, the father warned, was the sink of all iniquities, and the sun should rise early, eat plainly, guard his health, and remember that he was now the youngest cardinal who had ever gone to that city, and must live so that people forgot the scandal of it. Then the father closed the letter of the century with a banker's final instruction to a 16-year-old prince of the church. Work to make the church proud of you, he wrote, and never forget that you must love the honor of the family and of the city. The hat had cost a daughter, a fortune in favors, and the last full year of Lorenzo's strength. He considered it the greatest deal he ever closed, and said so. Time would prove him right in a way that would have terrified him, because the clock was running out on everything at once. The gout that had crippled his father and grandfather had Lorenzo now. Joined by agonies, the doctors could neither name nor touch. And through the winter of 1492 he failed fast. 43 years old, and dying in the villa at Careggi where Cosimo had died, where his father had died. In the bed that had become the family's departure gate, the deathbed gathered the whole story into one room. Poliziano was there and wrote the account that survives. The doctors administered their desperation, a potion of pulverized pearls and precious stones, medicine as alchemy, and Lorenzo, who had traded in gems his whole life, took it with the black humor of a connoisseur. Pico came, and the dying man managed jokes, and then, by Poliziano's account and the accounts that spread from it, a last visitor climbed to the room, a Dominican friar whose apocalyptic sermons had lately set the city on fire, a Gaunt Ferrarese named Girolamo Savonarola, whom Lorenzo himself had helped bring back to Florence. What passed between them grew into legend within a decade, the friar demanding Lorenzo restore liberty to Florence, the tyrant turning his face to the wall unabsolved. The sober versions, closest to the room, describe something quieter, a blessing sought and given. Label the dramatic version what it is. Propaganda composed later by the friar's followers. When the friar ruled the city and the Medici were fugitives, what no one needed to invent was the timing. Lorenzo de' Medici died on the night of the 8th of April, 1492, and the man at his bedside in the final hours was the man who would inherit his city, dismantle his family's world, and burn its beauty in the public square. The reckonings began at once, and the truest one came from a dry, unsentimental source, the Ferrarese ambassador, no friend of Florence, wrote home a single sentence of analysis. This man's death, he reported, is the worst news for Italy that could be. Within 2 years the prophecy would need no interpreter. The needle had been pulled from the compass, and the compass was about to meet a hurricane coming down out of France, tens of thousands strong, with siege guns. No Italian wall was built to answer, and in the palace on the Via Larga, the heir to the lists, the debts, the enemies, and the balance of Italy was a handsome, athletic, catastrophically confident young man of 21, whom his own father, in a line the family preserved, had sized up in advance like an epitaph. I have 3 sons. Lorenzo used to say, one is foolish, one is clever, and one is kind. The kind one was dead in the cathedral. The clever one wore a cardinal's hat in Rome, Florence, and everything 4 generations had built now belonged to the foolish one. Piero de' Medici had been raised for the succession the way his father had been, tutored by Poliziano, drilled in diplomacy, married to a Roman Orsini bride like his father before him. And none of it took. The flaw was not stupidity. Whatever his father's cruel line about the foolish son suggested, Piero was quick enough, and he looked the part better than any Medici ever had. Tall, handsome, a champion athlete who competed in horse races and a rough Florentine ball game with genuine distinction. The flaw was that he had absorbed the family's position without the family's method. 3 generations had held Florence by remembering, every single day, that their power was a performance staged inside a republic, that the city obeyed the Medici, because the Medici never demanded obedience. Piero demanded it. He kept state like a young lord, made men wait, took counsel from his Orsini relatives instead of the old Florentine hands, and treated the network of friends his ancestors had spent a century cultivating as staff. Within a year of Lorenzo's funeral, the grumbling in the city had a new note in it. One the family had spent 90 years making sure was never heard. People said the Medici had begun acting like masters. The performance was over, and only the power was left. And power, without the performance, was exactly the thing Florence had been built to destroy. He might have survived his own manner in ordinary times, He inherited the end of the world instead. In the summer of 1494, the storm that Lorenzo's diplomacy had spent 20 years holding off finally broke over the Alps. Charles VIII of France, a young king with an inherited legal claim to the throne of Naples and a head full of crusading fantasy, came down into Italy to collect the claim in person. And he brought a new kind of war with him. Italians counted armies in the low thousands and fought them in maneuvers that historians have compared to armed chess. Charles brought roughly 30,000 professionals, Swiss pike squares that killed rather than jockeyed, and above all, a siege train of dozens of bronze cannon on mobile carriages, guns that could open a medieval wall in hours. Italian fortresses had been designed for a world where a siege took months. The French artillery made every wall in Italy obsolete in a single campaigning season, and the princes of the peninsula, who had spent decades playing Lorenzo's balancing game, discovered that the board itself had been flipped. The French route to Naples ran straight through Tuscany, and Florence faced the choice that would define the decade: Milan, whose usurping regent, Ludovico Sforza, had actually invited the French in to serve his own feuds, stood aside. The Pope maneuvered, Naples armed, Piero, against the instincts of the city's whole trading class, whose biggest foreign market was France itself, chose loyalty to Naples and defiance of Charles, on the theory that this was what his father would have done. It was a defensible read of the old playbook, and it might even have worked if the man executing it had possessed his father's nerve. Then the French army entered Tuscany, and the small border fortress of Fivizzano was stormed with a thoroughness Italy had not seen in living memory. The garrison and much of the population put to the sword, and the news of the massacre ran ahead of the army like heat before a fire. The Florentine strongpoints at Sarzana and Pietrasanta prepared to resist. The Republic's mercenaries hovered, and Piero, 22 years old, holding his father's position in a game whose rules had just been rewritten in blood, panicked. What he did next has to be laid out plainly, because it destroyed in 4 days what 4 generations had built, without consulting the government, without informing the councils, without even bringing the city's leading men into the secret. Piero rode out of Florence to the French camp to negotiate personally with the king. He had a model in his head, and every Florentine could name it: his father's legendary voyage to Naples, the solo gamble that had turned catastrophe into triumph. The comparison shows exactly why the son failed. Where the father soared, Lorenzo had gone to Naples after months of secret preparation, holding cards he had counted, to see a king whose interests he had mapped. Piero went to Charles with nothing prepared and nothing to trade. A frightened young man, walking into the tent of a conqueror whose army was already winning. Charles received him graciously and stated terms that were less a negotiation than an inventory. He wanted the fortresses of Sarzana and Pietrasanta. He wanted Pisa, the anchor of Florentine power in the west, and Livorno, Florence's own port, held by French garrisons for the duration of the campaign. He wanted a loan of 200,000 florins. Piero, on his own authority, with the French cannon parked behind the conversation, agreed to all of it. He handed over, in a single interview, the fortress ring that protected the Republic, the port that carried its trade, and the subject city his ancestors had spent 70 years securing, and he rode home to tell Florence what he had given away. The city already knew. News of the surrender had arrived ahead of him, and Florence had passed through shock into a cold, specific fury. On the 9th of November, 1494, Piero rode to the Palazzo della Signoria to explain himself to the government, and the government refused him the door. He was told to enter alone, without his armed escort, through a side entrance, like a man under suspicion rather than the master of the city. He hesitated in the piazza, and the crowd began to gather, and the sound began. Whistles. Years. Then stones. Piero retreated to the palace on the Via Larga, and somewhere in that hour the bell of the Signoria began to toll, the same bell that had rung against the Papacy 16 years before, and the city that had once roared Palla Palla to save the Medici now poured into the streets to finish them. Piero, his wife, his children, and his brothers got out of Florence that night through the San Gallo gate, riding north in the dark with what they could carry. The Cardinal, Giovanni, went last and coolest, and the story the family treasured afterward says he slipped out, disguised in the robe of a Franciscan friar, having first arranged for the most precious of the library's manuscripts to be carried to safety. He paused, the story runs, on the hill road above the city, and looked back at Florence in the November light. He would see it again. It would take 18 years. Behind them, the city erupted into the oldest ritual of failed regimes. The mob sacked the Medici palace and the garden by San Marco, and what was not stolen was scattered. The gems, the vases, the antiquities, Lorenzo's collections pouring into the streets and the pawnshops of Europe. The government moved with a speed that showed how thin the Golden Age's loyalty had worn, declaring the Medici rebels and traitors, setting a price on Piero's head, confiscating everything the family owned, and striking their emblems from the walls. 4 days after Piero rode to the French camp, the dynasty that had governed Florence for 60 years did not exist there anymore, and 9 days after the flight, Charles VIII of France rode into Florence at the head of his army, lance couched on his thigh in the posture of a conqueror entering a taken city, and quartered his troops on the population. The occupation lasted 11 days and produced one scene that Florence told forever after. The king, treating the city as his by conquest, presented demands. Restoration of Piero by some accounts, among the bargaining points. An enormous payment for certain. The Florentine negotiators resisted. Tempers rose, and Charles threatened to sound his trumpets and let his army settle the matter. A Republic official named Piero Capponi seized the draft terms from the French secretary and tore them up in front of the king, answering, in the line every Florentine schoolchild once knew, that if you sound your trumpets, we shall ring our bells. It was a real threat, dressed as rhetoric. An army quartered inside a hostile city of narrow streets, with every tower and window a fortress, faced ugly arithmetic if the population rose. And Charles, whose goal was Naples, chose to laugh, settle for a subsidy and free passage, and march on south. The bells had faced down the trumpets. Florence was rid of its dynasty and rid of its conqueror in the same month, and it stood in the wreckage of both, asking the question that fills the next chapter of this story. The Medici had been the government, the treasury, the foreign policy, and the identity of Florence for 3 generations. What fills a hole that size? The answer was already in the pulpit of San Marco. In the convent, Cosimo had rebuilt to buy back his soul, preaching to overflow crowds that everything now happening had been foretold, that the sword of God had come over Italy exactly as promised, and that Florence, purged of its tyrants, was called to become the new Jerusalem. The Medici had spent 60 years proving a city could be ruled through money and beauty. The friar was about to spend 4 proving it could be ruled through the fear of God. And his kingdom would end in the same piazza where the Papacy had swung. In a fire the whole world remembers. Girolamo Savonarola did not look like the most powerful man in Florence. He was small, ugly by every account, including friendly ones, with a great hooked nose, thick lips, and burning green eyes under heavy brows. A Ferrarese outsider who spoke with a foreigner's accent and had failed, in his first Florentine posting years earlier, to draw any audience at all. His order had actually sent him away once, his preaching judged too harsh, and his voice too grating for the sophisticated ears of Lorenzo's city. What brought him back, in one of history's neater ironies, was a recommendation to Lorenzo himself from Pico della Mirandola, who admired the friar's learning. And what made him a phenomenon was that he preached the one sermon Renaissance Florence had never heard. Every other pulpit flattered the city. Savonarola told Florence it was damned. The banquets, the carnival songs, the nude goddesses on the palace walls, the gambling, the usury that underwrote all of it. He catalogued the city's sins in detail, in the plain butcher's Italian of the streets rather than the ornamented Latin of the humanists. And he attached a deadline. God's sword was coming over the Alps. He preached a new Cyrus who would scourge Italy. And it was coming soon. He had been saying it for years while the golden age glittered, and the fashionable had shrugged. Then Lorenzo died in April of 1492, and misfortunes gathered exactly as foretold. And in September of 1494, Charles VIII crossed the Alps with an army. No Italian could stop. And the shrugging ended. The friar had called it, in a city stripped in a single autumn of its ruling family, its fortresses, its port, and its certainties. The man who had predicted the catastrophe owned the explanation for it. And the explanation was the scarcest commodity in Florence. He converted the panic into a constitution. Savonarola held no office ever and needed none, which should sound familiar, because Florence was repeating its own history with the polarity reversed. Like Cosimo, the friar ruled through others, preaching the program from San Marco, while allied citizens enacted it in the councils. Under his urging, the city adopted the broadest government in its history, a great council on the Venetian model with thousands of citizens eligible to sit, a genuine widening of the Republic that the friars' faction pushed through and that Florence would remember fondly long after it remembered him with a shudder. A general amnesty calmed the vengeance politics. Taxes were reformed. And alongside the civic program came the moral one, enforced not by police but by something more penetrating. Organized bands of boys and young men, the friars' blessed children, who marched the streets in white, collecting alms, disrupting gamblers, shaming women in immodest dress, knocking on doors to ask, with the terrible courtesy of believing children, whether the household possessed any vanities it wished to surrender. Florence, the capital of European pleasure, cancelled itself. The Carnival of 1497. The season Lorenzo had filled with masks and torchlight and his own songs about seizing the day, climaxed instead in the Piazza della Signoria, with a wooden pyramid 60 feet high, hung and stacked with the surrendered sins of the city. Mirrors, wigs, cosmetics, dice, playing cards, carnival masks, immodest dress, loot, songbooks, the poems of Boccaccio and Petrarch, and paintings, a later tradition, recorded by Vasari a generation afterward and not firmly supported by contemporary evidence, claims that Sandro Botticelli, now a trembling convert of the friar, carried canvases of his own to the pile with his own hands. The trumpets sounded, the crowd sang hymns, and the whole gorgeous surface of the Medici century went up in flame. The event has a name that outlived everyone present, the Bonfire of the Vanities. Stand back from the fire for a moment and look at what it was actually consuming, because this chapter is the hinge on which the whole Medici story swings. For 60 years, the family had ruled through a single unstated equation: that beauty was legitimacy, that a city made splendid was a city made loyal, that a man who filled Florence with libraries and processions and painted goddesses had thereby earned the right to run it from behind a desk. Savonarola was a refutation of the equation itself, a demonstration that the deepest hunger in the city was for something the Medici had never sold, and that all the pall on all the walls could be repriced overnight as tyranny's wallpaper. The friar's Florence was everything Medici Florence was not: plain, penitent, republican, terrified. And for 4 years it worked, which is the fact every history of the Renaissance has to sit with. The city of Botticelli chose the bonfire, freely, by majority, singing it could not last, and the reasons it could not last were stacked from the beginning. The friar's foreign policy was a prophecy, alliance with France as God's instrument, and the prophecy stopped cooperating. Charles VIII took Naples, lost it even faster, was mauled on his way home at Fornovo, and retreated over the Alps, having accomplished nothing except proving Italy conquerable. An audition every great power in Europe had watched carefully. Florence, alone on the French side while the rest of Italy leagued against the invader, paid for the friar's prophecy with isolation, a ruinous and unwinnable war to recover rebellious Pisa, famine and plague, and in Rome, the friar had made the one enemy his particular gifts were useless against. The papal throne now held Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, a man of enormous ability and no shame whatsoever, whose open children and public mistresses made him the living embodiment of everything Savonarola's sermons condemned. And Savonarola condemned him from the pulpit by escalating degrees, until he was calling the Pope's church a harlot and hinting that the Pope himself was no Christian at all. Alexander responded, like the patient professional he was, first with flattering invitations to Rome, declined, then with an offer, widely reported and never disproven, of a cardinal's hat for the friar's silence, answered from the pulpit with the cry that the only red hat he wanted was a hat of blood. And finally, in May of 1497, with excommunication, Savonarola preached on regardless, celebrated Mass regardless, and thereby handed every enemy he had. And 4 years of moral government had manufactured them in every tavern, workshop, and great palace in Florence, the single charge that could kill him. The city faced interdict, the destruction of its trade, for harbouring a disobedient friar whose promised French saviour was never coming back. The end arrived through a door out of the Middle Ages. A rival Franciscan preacher, tired of the Dominicans' claims of divine mandate, challenged Savonarola's party to prove it the old way, by ordeal. two friars walking together through a corridor of fire. God to preserve his own. The challenge was almost certainly theatre that got away from everyone. And on the appointed day, in April of 1498, the Piazza della Signoria, filled with a crowd hungry for a miracle, while the champions haggled for hours over conditions. Whether the Dominican might carry the consecrated host into the flames. And the delays stretched. And then the sky opened into a drenching thunderstorm. And the ordeal was called off with nobody burned, and everybody cheated. The crowd promised the direct intervention of God and sent home wet. Turned overnight. The following day, a mob stormed San Marco. Cosimo's San Marco, fighting past friars who defended the convent, against every instruction, with candlesticks and a couple of smuggled firearms, and Savonarola was arrested with his two closest lieutenants and taken to the same bell tower cell in the Palazzo della Signoria, the Alberghetto, where Cosimo de' Medici had waited out his own crisis 65 years earlier. The wheel of this story turns through that little room twice. What followed was ugly in the specific way that frightened governments are ugly. The friar was tortured on the strappado, hoisted and dropped on bound wrists, repeatedly, a treatment designed to dislocate shoulders and dissolve certainty. And, between sessions, he signed confessions of false prophecy that he retracted when the pain stopped and signed again when it resumed. Papal commissioners came north to make sure of the verdict, one of them carrying instructions that survive in substance, that Savonarola was to die, even were he another John the Baptist. On the 23rd of May, 1498, in the Piazza della Signoria, on the spot where his pyramid of vanities had burned 15 months before, Savonarola and his two companions were hanged in chains from a single gibbet and burned, the fire lit. Chroniclers noted, by the same office of the government that had once lit his holy bonfires, and the ashes were carted to the Ponte Vecchio and shoveled into the Arno to deny his followers relics. They gathered at the bridge for years anyway. On the anniversary, dropping flowers into the river at dawn, Florence was now free of the Medici and free of the prophet. And it discovered that it was simply free. Alone in the new Italy, with a citizen constitution, an empty treasury, a war it could not win, and no protector of any kind, human or divine. The Republic would hold on for another dozen years. Sober, earnest, and outgunned. While the powers of Europe fought across Italy for stakes no city-state could match. And while, in Rome, our fat, cheerful, patient cardinal named Giovanni de' Medici worked the conclaves and the courts, waiting for the wheel to turn again, the friar had beaten the bankers with a prophecy. The bankers would beat the prophecy with the oldest Medici weapon of all. They would simply outlast it. For 18 years after the mob sacked the palace on the Via Larga, Florence ran itself, and the man who embodies those years better than any politician was a thin, sharp-eyed civil servant with a taste for black humour who walked to work at the Palazzo della Signoria every morning to manage the Republic's wars and letters. His name was Niccolo Machiavelli, and before his name became an adjective, it was a signature at the bottom of thousands of dispatches from a government of merchants trying to survive in a world of lions. The Republic he served was the friar's constitution without the friar, the great council of thousands of citizens, broadened suffrage, genuine elections, the real thing, at last, after a century of rigged bags. In 1502, the city even amended the design, electing a respected merchant named Piero Soderini as gonfaloniere for life, a permanent chairman meant to give the government the continuity the Medici had once supplied privately. Soderini was honest, decent, hard-working, and dim exactly where brightness was needed. And Florence half loved and half mocked him. Machiavelli became his right hand, and together they addressed the Republic's two consuming problems. The first was Pisa, in revolt since the French invasion, absorbing Florentine blood and treasure year after humiliating year. The second was that every army defending Florence belonged to someone else. The city rented its soldiers, and rented soldiers. Machiavelli argued in memo after memo, would never die for a customer. His solution was radical for its day. A citizen militia, Tuscan farm boys drilled with pikes on Sundays. An army that belonged to the state, it defended. The Great Council approved it. The militia marched. And in 1509, the new model army starved Pisa into final surrender. Sober, frugal, self-governing Florence had won its war. And for a moment, the Republic of sober men looked like the future. Meanwhile, the exiles learned what exile was. Piero de' Medici spent his banishment proving his nickname, the unfortunate, attaching himself to any army pointed at Tuscany, failing in 2 attempted returns, and sinking into a wandering soldier's life. In 1503, retreating with a French army after a lost battle in the south, he drowned in the flooded Garigliano River when his overloaded boat went down, 31 years old. And Florence barely paused at the news. The family's future now rested entirely on the middle brother, the clever one, and the clever one was playing a longer game than anyone in Florence understood. Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici had settled in Rome, bad, near-sighted, endlessly amiable, heaping a modest palace that became a clubhouse for exiled Florentines, artists, musicians, and men of letters. He hunted, collected books, made no enemies, missed no funeral or conclave, and waited. His goal never changed through all of it, and everyone in his circle knew what it was. The family would go home. His cousin waited beside him. Giulio, the orphan of the Papacy conspiracy, grown now into a handsome, careful, subtle man who served as the cardinal's manager and shadow. Rome in those years was run by Julius II, the warrior pope, a white bearded force of nature who wore armor over his vestments and was tearing down old St. Peter's to build the greatest church in Christendom over his own future tomb. Giovanni attached himself loyally to Julius. And when the Pope went to war, the cardinal went with the army as papal legate, which is how the fat, bookish Medici came to be present, and briefly a prisoner at the murderous Battle of Ravenna in 1512, and how he came to be standing beside the Pope's Spanish allies in the exact season when the great wheel of European war swung around at last to point at Florence. The Republic's fatal error had been written years earlier. Soderini's Florence had stayed faithful to France through every turn of the wars, and by 1512 France was losing, driven from Italy by a holy league of the Pope. Spain and Venice, the victors turned to settle accounts with France's friends, and a Spanish army under the Viceroy of Naples crossed the Apennines toward Florence, with Cardinal de' Medici travelling in its train. The family restoration, now an official war aim of the League. Between the Spaniards and the city stood the fortified town of Prato, 10 miles out, garrisoned by the militia Machiavelli had built. And what happened there on the 29th of August broke the Republic in a single afternoon. The Spanish guns opened a breach. The veteran infantry poured through, and the Tuscan farm boys, brave enough behind walls, shattered at the reality of professional soldiers at close quarters. What followed was one of the atrocities of the age. Prato was sacked for days. Thousands of its people killed. The survivors tortured for hidden coins. Nuns hunted through their convents. And the reports that reached Florence hour by hour did exactly what such reports are meant to do. The city read its own future in Prato's ashes. Within days, Soderini resigned and fled. The government capitulated. The Great Council was dissolved. And on a September day in 1512, 18 years, almost to the week, after a Medici cardinal in a borrowed friar's robe had looked back at the city from the hill road, Giovanni de' Medici rode into Florence, and the pall went back up on the walls. The new order showed its teeth once, and the tooth marks landed on the Republic's most loyal servant. Machiavelli was dismissed from his post, and months later his name surfaced on a list found in the pocket of two feckless anti-Medici plotters. He was arrested, questioned under the strappado, the same rope that had broken Savonarola, and he took the drops without confessing to anything, because there was nothing to confess. Released in a general amnesty, he retired, broke to a farm south of the city, and in the evenings, by his own famous account in a letter, he washed off the mud of the day, dressed in his old official robes as if reporting to a government that no longer wanted him, and sat down with the ancient historians to write a short book, distilling everything he had learned, watching princes, popes, and republics devour each other. He dedicated The Prince to the Medici, hoping for a job. They never gave him a real one. The book outlived every throne in Europe. Julius II died in February of 1513, and the cardinals went into conclave to choose a successor to the most exhausting pope in memory. The mood in the locked halls favored someone younger, agreeable, and generous after a decade of the old man's wars. And the college found its man in the 37-year-old cardinal from Florence, so racked that week by an abscess that he had to be carried into the conclave on a litter, which his supporters gently suggested was a sign of a conveniently short reign to come. On the 11th of March, Giovanni de' Medici was elected pope, and took the name Leo X. He was not even a priest yet. They ordained him 4 days after the election, and crowned him within the week. Measure the moment against the whole arc of this story, because this is the summit the ledger had been climbing toward for 116 years. A century earlier, Giovanni de' Medici had been a clerk in a cousin's counting house, in a trade the church called mortal sin, keeping books that Dante's readers believed would damn him. His great-great-grandson now sat on the throne of St. Peter, holding the keys that bound and loosed sin itself, the family that had spent generations buying absolution by the chapel and the convent, San Marco, San Lorenzo, the altarpieces, the libraries, every florin of it a payment against the usury account, now owned the institution that issued the receipts. In Florence, the news set off celebrations that witnesses compared to a city gone mad. Bonfires, fountains running wine, the pall blazing from every window, because every Florentine understood instantly what a Florentine pope meant for business. And from Rome, the family sealed the arrangement at home. The new pope ruled Florence through relatives. His brother, then his nephew, then his cousin Giulio, whom he made Archbishop of Florence and then Cardinal, brushing aside the small legal obstacle of Giulio's illegitimate birth with a finding that his parents had been secretly betrothed. A document nobody in Italy believed and nobody in Italy challenged. The orphan of the Papacy blood now ran the city his father had died in and wore the red hat of the church that had blessed the killing. A sentence has attached itself to Leo's accession, reported later and second-hand, so label it accordingly, but preserved because it fit the man so perfectly that Europe chose to remember it. God has given us the papacy. He is supposed to have written to his brother, "Let us enjoy it," whatever he actually wrote. Enjoyment is a fair summary of the reign. Leo hunted in scarlet boots with a court of hundreds. He kept musicians, poots, jesters, and a pet white elephant named Hanno, a gift from the King of Portugal, whom the Pope adored and Rome turned into a celebrity. He gambled, banqueted, and gave with both hands, emptying the treasury Julius had filled and then borrowing at rates that would have made his great-great-grandfather close the account. He was also, in the family manner, a serious patron with serious taste. Raphael worked at the peak of his powers, painting the papal apartments, and when the architect Bramante died, Leo handed Raphael the largest construction project on earth, the new St. Peter's, rising slowly over the old basilica's bones. The project was the pride of the papacy and its money pit. Julius had begun tearing down the most sacred building in the West on the promise of something greater, and greatness, measured in travertine and genius, had to be paid for in cash. The papacy did not have. The cash was found, and the finding broke the world. The Church had long taught that the Pope could draw on the treasury of merit stored up by Christ and the saints, dispensing it to the faithful as indulgences, remissions of the punishment owed for sin, granted for pilgrimage, for charity, and, in the practice that had grown routine, for money offered to holy works. In 1515, Leo authorized a great indulgence campaign in Germany to fund St. Peter's, and the campaign's plumbing tells you everything about what the holy economy had become. A young nobleman, Albrecht of Brandenburg, wanted a third bishopric. He was not legally entitled to hold. Rome named its price. Albrecht borrowed the enormous sum from the Fugger banking house of Augsburg, and to let him repay the bankers. The Pope granted him the indulgence concession for his territories, the proceeds to be split, half to St. Peter's, half, quietly, to service the Fugger loan. Salvation had been securitized. The friars who preached the indulgence across Germany sold it like the product it had become, and the most famous of them, a Dominican named Johann Tetzel, was remembered for a sales jingle, "His enemies never let die." As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. In the small Saxon university town of Wittenberg, an Augustinian friar and professor of scripture watched his parishioners come home waving Tetzel's certificates, and concluded that souls were being swindled. On the 31st of October, 1517, Martin Luther published 95 theses for academic debate on the power of indulgences, and the new printing presses, which could do in days what scribes did in years, carried them across Germany in weeks. Leo, informed, saw a squabble among friars, the kind of thing Rome had managed for 1,000 years, and by one report waved it away as the work of a drunken German who would think differently when sober. The misjudgment was total, and it was a Medici misjudgment. The assumption that this, like everything, was at bottom a negotiation. Luther was not negotiating. Pressed. He widened his attack from indulgences to the authority that sold them, excommunicated in 1521. He burned the papal bull in public, summoned before the emperor at Worms. He refused to recant, and half of Europe stood up behind him. Princes, with their own reasons to stop the flow of German silver over the Alps. Cities, with their own quarrels, with Rome, a printing industry with its first mass market, and a generation of believers for whom the sale of grace had come to smell like fraud. The indulgence campaign lit the fuse rather than packing the powder. And the powder had been accumulating for a century. But the fuse was Medici, attached to a Medici building, run through a Medici-style financing structure. And the timing belongs to this story. Christendom, the single spiritual commonwealth, this whole story has moved inside. Cracked down the middle in Leo's reign, over a fundraising instrument, for a building, commissioned by the family that had spent a century turning money into grace. The Medici had finally captured the machinery of salvation, and the capture broke the machine. Leo never saw the size of it. In December of 1521, at 46, he caught a chill after celebrating a military victory, and died so suddenly that Rome whispered, "Poison," a claim examined and dismissed, then and since. He left the treasury not merely empty but mortgaged, the debts so vast that the jeweled tiaras were pawned, and he left the dynasty's secular hopes in ruins around 2 fresh graves. His brother had died in 1516. His nephew, Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, in 1519, each without a legitimate male heir, and the ancient line of Cosimo was reduced, in legitimate descent, to a girl, the nephew's daughter, orphaned at 3 weeks old when her father followed her mother into the tomb, was named Caterina, and this story will meet her again in a French crown. Everything else the family had, the papacy's memory, Florence's obedience, the whole inheritance, now passed to the hands of the man who had spent 20 years as the quiet cousin at every Medici elbow. Cardinal Giulio, the Papacy orphan, elected pope in his turn in 1523 as Clement VII. Contemporaries called him the most capable cardinal in the college. And he may have been. He was about to preside over the worst decade Rome had suffered since the barbarians. And the proof would come over the walls with the dawn. Clement VII took the papal throne with the best resume in the College of Cardinals, and Rome expected mastery. He had run Florence, run the Church's diplomacy, run Leo's pontificate in everything but name, and the ambassador's first reports home praised a serious, sober, learned pope who would repair his cousin's extravagance. Within 4 years, those same ambassadors were writing obituaries for the papacy itself, and the distance between the 2 sets of dispatches is the measure of the man. Clement's flaw was neither stupidity nor vice. It was that he could see every side of every question with perfect clarity and could not, under pressure, choose one. In the counting house, deliberation is prudence. In a war, it is death. And Clement had inherited a war. The war was the duel of the century. On one side stood Francis, the first of France. On the other, the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. a young man on whom the marriages and funerals of 2 dynasties had piled Spain, Naples, the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, and the silver of the new American mines. An inheritance so vast that men said the sun never set on it. Italy was the arena where the 2 giants met, and the popes of the age faced a single strategic question: which giant to lean toward, and when? Clement leaned toward both. Alternately, secretly, and always at the wrong moment. He signed with the emperor, then panicked at imperial strength and negotiated with France. In 1525, the emperor's army annihilated the French at Pavia and took King Francis prisoner on the field. And Clement, terrified of a Habsburg Italy, helped organize a league against the victor and pulled a released and vengeful Francis into it. Keep sight of what the Pope was actually protecting through all the maneuvering, because it was never only the Papal States. Clement was playing for Florence too, for the family's grip on the city, for the survival of the whole Medici position in Italy. And the double stake is exactly what kept him changing sides. The emperor's answer was to let the problem solve itself. In the spring of 1527, an imperial army in northern Italy, tens of thousands of Spanish veterans and German Landsknecht mercenaries, many of the Germans fervent Lutherans who regarded the Pope as Antichrist enthroned, ran out of pay, out of food, and out of patience. Its commanders lost control, and the army turned south. Moving on, Rome, not as a strategy, but as a mob with pikes, marching toward the richest unlooted city in Italy, with mutiny at its back and no orders anyone could enforce. On the 6th of May, 1527, in a dawn fog off the Tiber, the horde hit the walls of the Borgo. Rome's defences were a few thousand militia and the Swiss Guard. The attackers' commander, the Duke of Bourbon, a French traitor in imperial service, was shot dead in the first assault. And the goldsmith, Benvenuto Cellini, serving a cannon on the ramparts, spent the rest of his life claiming the shot, a claim historians file with Cellini's other claims. The commander's death removed the last thread of restraint. The walls were carried, and the army poured into the city with no one alive holding authority over it. The Swiss Guard made its stand on the steps of St. Peter's and by the obelisk beside it, and was destroyed. 189 men fighting a delaying action that bought the minutes that mattered. Clement, praying in the Vatican chapel as the shooting closed in, was bundled by his attendants into the Pasetto, the fortified corridor running along the top of an ancient wall from the palace to the castle of Sant'Angelo, and he ran the length of it, purple train hiked up, a Medici pope fleeing above the rooftops of falling Rome, while a bishop threw a cloak over his white robes so the shooters below would lose the target. The church bells of Rome were ringing the alarm as he ran. And then, quarter by quarter, they stopped. What the army did to Rome over the following weeks stands with the worst atrocities of the century. The sack was not a riot that burned out in a night. It was a systematic, prolonged strip mining of a civilization's capital. Palaces gutted, churches emptied to the altar stones, tombs of popes cracked open for the rings, relics stripped of their gold and thrown in the streets, priests and nuns tortured, ransomed, murdered, citizens hung by the arms in their own courtyards until they revealed the hiding place of coins, then hung again, because there was always another Landsknecht who had not been paid. The Lutherans among the soldiery added theatre, parading in cardinals' robes, stabling horses in the Vatican, and scratching Luther's name into Raphael's frescoes. Where the graffiti survives, deaths ran into the tens of thousands between the killing and the plague that followed it. The population of Rome roughly halved. The high Renaissance, as a Roman fact, ended that May. Its artists dead or scattered, its workshops burned, its confidence gone, and men across Europe, Catholic and Protestant alike, read the ruins the same way. As a judgment, Rome had believed it sat outside history. Protected, eternal, it had been treated like any other town, and by the army of the Catholic emperor. Clement held out in Sant'Angelo for a month, watching the smoke, and surrendered in June. A prisoner in all but name, hostage cardinals handed over, an unpayable ransom promised, the treasury so bare that Cellini, by his own cheerful account, was set up in a makeshift mint inside the castle, melting down the gold settings of the papal jewels, while the Pope kept the loose stones sewn into the hem of his robe. And in Florence, the news of the sack did exactly what news of Medici catastrophe had done in 1494. Within weeks the city rose, expelled the family's governors and the two teenage bastards who embodied the succession, restored the Great Council, and proclaimed the Republic reborn, this time under the formal kingship of Christ. The last Savonarolans, living to see the friars' program voted back into law. The Medici had lost Rome and Florence in the same season, and the Pope, who had once been the subtle cousin, the fixer, the ablest man in the college, sat in a half-burned castle amid a murdered city, bearded now, in mourning like a penitent, holding one asset his enemies could not loot. He was still Pope. The Emperor, whatever his soldiers had done, could not unmake that. And a Pope, however humiliated, still had things an emperor needed: coronations, legitimacies, annulments granted and annulments refused. Clement began, slowly, in captivity, to trade. The trade took 3 years to complete, and its shape decided the fate of Florence. Clement made his peace with Charles in Bologna in 1530. The Pope personally crowned the emperor with the Iron Crown of Lombardy and the Imperial Crown, the last time a pope ever crowned a Holy Roman Emperor, and the price of the ceremony had been negotiated in advance. Imperial arms would restore the Medici to Florence through the autumn and winter of 1529 into 1530. An imperial army sat down before the city, and Florence, Republican Florence, gave the age one of its great doomed performances. The citizens had prepared with a seriousness that startled Europe, and the man who designed the defences was Michelangelo Buonarroti, the sculptor raised at Lorenzo's table, now Governor-General of Fortifications for the Republic, besieging his patron's heirs, wrapping the fragile bell tower of San Miniato in mattresses and wool bales against the imperial guns. The city held for 10 months, through bombardment, famine, and plague. Its hired commander, Malatesta Baglioni, negotiating treachery behind its back in the finest condottiere tradition. Its last field army, broken at Gavinana, in a battle where the imperial commander and the Florentine commander both died. In August of 1530, starved and betrayed, Florence capitulated. The Republic of the Great Council was abolished, this time forever. The leading Republicans were executed or exiled, and Michelangelo, in hiding in a crypt below San Lorenzo with the escape sketches still on the walls today, was pardoned by name from Rome, because Clement, whatever his failures, refused to waste a Michelangelo, and set him back to work carving the family's tombs. Rome sacked, Florence broken, and out of the double ruin, Clement extracted, coldly and completely, the two prizes the family had chased for a century. In 1532, a hand-picked assembly formally abolished the Florentine constitution and vested the government of the city, by hereditary right, in the Medici line. The Republic was legislated out of existence, signed away in its own council hall, and the first hereditary Duke of Florence, the Pope's candidate, there was a 19-year-old whose parentage polite Florence discussed in whispers, Alessandro de' Medici, officially the bastard of the late Duke of Urbino, widely rumoured, then and since, to be Clement's own son. Contemporary and later accounts associated his mother with African or Moorish ancestry, and the streets called him Il Moro, though the evidence behind every version of his parentage is thin, tangled, and politically charged. What nobody disputed was the position Alessandro received the ducal title, an imperial bride, Charles V's own natural daughter, and a city ordered to obey him. After 135 years of invisible thrones, leather bags, and rule from behind the desk, the mask was off at last. Florence had a monarch. The monarch was a Medici, and the arrangement had been purchased at the price of Rome itself. The dynasty's founder had warned his sons to stay out of the public eye. His heirs now owned the public square, by imperial charter, and the first thing the new monarchy required, as monarchies do, was to survive its own family. It would fail at that within 5 years, in a locked bedroom, at the hands of a cousin, over a woman, with a knife. The first crowned Medici lasted 5 years, and the manner of his going told Florence that the new monarchy had imported the oldest problem of monarchies, which is that a throne is a target with a chair attached. Duke Alessandro ruled the way frightened regimes rule. The great bell of the Signoria, the one that had rung against the Papacy and against Piero, was taken down and broken, so that no mob could ever again be summoned by it, and its bronze was recast. Weapons were called in from the citizenry, and on the high ground by the northern gate rose the regime's true signature, a massive pentagonal fortress, the Fortezza de Basso, designed by the military engineers who were reshaping walls all over Italy, and aimed, as every Florentine could see from its gun platforms, not outward at invading armies, but inward at the city itself. Republican exiles gathered in Rome and Venice, pleaded their case before the emperor, and got nowhere, because Alessandro was the emperor's son-in-law and the emperor's garrison policy in one person. The duke himself was, by the hostile sources, a tyrant of appetite, prowling convents and other men's marriages, and by the friendlier ones, a rough but capable young ruler with a streak of genuine accessibility to the poor. Read the sources against each other, and a plausible man emerges. Coarse, energetic, far from stupid, and fatally bored. And boredom in a prince opens the door to the companion who never bores him. That companion was his distant cousin Lorenzino de' Medici, and Lorenzino is one of the strangest figures in the entire dynasty. He came from the junior branch of the family, the descendants of old Cosimo's brother. A line this story will meet again in the next chapter. Small, slight, bookish, and brilliant, a collector of ancient coins and a writer of real talent. He had already made himself notorious in Rome by knocking the heads off ancient statues in a fit whose motive nobody ever established. Vandalism from a man who worshipped antiquity. In Florence, he attached himself to Alessandro and became indispensable. The fixer of the Duke's pleasures, the procurer, the flatterer, the shadow at the ducal elbow, despised by the court as a parasite and nicknamed for his gloom and his thinness. The philosopher. For years he played the part without a false note. What was actually happening inside him remains the mystery. It was in 1537. Because the act he was preparing had no accomplices among the exiles. No foreign backers. No network. Nothing but a plan. A hired killer called Scoronconcolo, and a performance of friendship sustained for years toward the target. On the night of the 6th of January, 1537, Epiphany night, with the city dark after the holiday, Lorenzino baited the trap with the oldest bait there is. He promised Alessandro a woman, a respectable and beautiful married noblewoman, his own aunt by marriage, to be delivered secretly to Lorenzino's bedroom, next door to the ducal palace. The Duke came alone, unarmored, left his few attendants outside, unbuckled his sword, and lay down on the bed to wait in the dark. He fell asleep. Lorenzino returned with Scoronconcolo, and the two of them fell on the sleeping man, and the killing was long and terrible. The first sword thrust through the body, the Duke fighting back with animal strength, biting down on Lorenzino's thumb to the bone and holding on while the hired man worked with his knife. The struggle wrecking the room until a final cut across the throat ended it. The assassins locked the door on the body, and Lorenzino, bleeding from his mangled hand, paused to write a line of Latin on the wall, from Virgil, and then rode for the gates and the north, leaving Florence a headless monarchy and history an enigma. Weeks later, from safety, he published an apology, a defense of the deed written in superb Tuscan prose, casting himself as the new Brutus, the tyrannicide, liberty's knife. It is one of the most eloquent political pamphlets of the Renaissance, and it persuaded almost no one, because the liberator had killed the tyrant and then simply run, alerting no Republicans, seizing no gates, raising no cry. Leaving the city he claimed to have freed to wake up 2 days later. The death kept secret by the Duke's ministers while they scrambled, and find itself vacant rather than free. The exiles he might have armed learned of the assassination too late to move. Whatever Lorenzino had done it for, glory, grievance, some private wound the sources hint at and cannot name, he had handed Florence a vacancy, and vacancies are filled by whoever moves fastest. The men who moved fastest were the regime's own managers, led by the subtlest politician in the city, the historian and fixer Francesco Guicciardini, Machiavelli's old friend and sparring partner. The legitimate male line of Cosimo the Elder was now extinct, 5 generations of it spent, and the succession law of 1532 pointed, failing that line, to the junior branch, the descendants of Cosimo's brother, Lorenzo, the branch of the Popolano cousins who had once feuded with the Magnificent over their plundered inheritance, the branch, in the final irony, of the assassin Lorenzino himself. Its available candidate was a 17-year-old country nobleman named Cosimo, son of the most famous soldier the family ever produced, the mercenary captain Giovanni delle Bandiniere, dead of a cannon wound a decade earlier, and of Maria Salviati, a granddaughter of Lorenzo the Magnificent, which stitched the two branches together in the boy's own blood. Young Cosimo had been raised far from court intrigue, on horses and hunting, and the grandees, who summoned him to Florence in January of 1537, chose him precisely for what he appeared to be: a rustic teenager, malleable, grateful, and safely dim, a duke to be managed by the men who elected him. Guicciardini led the negotiations and drafted the conditions. Real power to remain with a council of the wise, the boy to reign and be advised. Charles V's representatives approved. The arrangement was signed, and the managers congratulated themselves on having converted an assassination into a smooth transfer with a figurehead attached. The figurehead then revealed himself, within months, to be the coldest and most capable ruler the Medici ever produced, and one of the most formidable state builders of the European 16th century. The exiles gave him his proving ground that same summer, invading Tuscany with a French-backed army of Republican émigrés under Filippo Strozzi, the richest private man in Italy and the Republic's last great hope. Cosimo's forces met them at the fortress of Montemerlo and crushed them in a morning. The Republican leaders were paraded back into Florence on mules, tried in batches, and beheaded in daily installments in the piazza, the executions running for days in a public arithmetic lesson about the new reign. Strozzi himself, held in the Fortezza de Basso, was found dead in his cell within the year, a sword beside him and a note, quoting Virgil, calling on an avenger to rise from his bones. Suicide, said the regime. The doubt was general, and the doubt was also useful, and young Cosimo let it stand. 17 years old, months into the job his electors had designed to be ornamental, he had destroyed the opposition in the field, liquidated its leadership at law, seen off his managers, and taken the government of Florence into his own hands, where it stayed for 37 years. Guicciardini, the master fixer who had planned to rule through the boy, retired to his villa to write his great history of Italy, and died there, managed out of power by a teenager. As for Lorenzino, the new Brutus, he ran through Europe for 11 years. Venice, France, Constantinople, Venice again, writing, hiding, celebrated by exiles and hunted by a patience that never slept. Cosimo did not rage. Cosimo filed, in February of 1548, on a street in Venice, in daylight. 2 hired soldiers finally reached the assassin and stabbed him to death beside the canal. 11 years and a month after Epiphany night, the message required no signature, and every court in Europe read it correctly. The last man to kill a Medici duke had been erased by the new one, and the new one forgot nothing, hurried nothing, and missed nothing. Florence, which had spent a century being governed by bankers pretending to be citizens, now belonged to something it had never actually seen before, a Medici who did not pretend at all. The teenager who took Florence in 1537 grew into a ruler that men compared, without affection, to a machine. Cosimo I rose before dawn and worked. He read the dispatches himself, annotated the tax returns himself, interviewed the engineers himself, and kept in his head the salt prices, garrison rosters, and grain reserves of every town in his dominion. He did not gamble, kept no mistresses through the prime of his reign, hunted for exercise rather than pageantry, and sat for portraits in black Spanish wool with a face that gave the painters nothing. The Venetian ambassadors, whose reports home are the best political journalism of the century, described a prince who trusted no one entirely, delegated nothing important, and was feared by everyone near him, including his own ministers. And then the ambassadors added the conclusion that mattered. The state functioned. Petitions were answered. Roads were safe. The books balanced. Florence had traded a century of brilliant improvisation for something it had never once possessed in its entire history. A government, the name Medici, on this duke, meant something new, and the change is the hinge of the whole final act. Every previous Medici had held power the family way, personally, informally, through friends and clients and favors, power that lived in a man and died with him. Cosimo set out, deliberately, to convert the family into a state, and he built the conversion piece by piece like the accountant he was at heart. He created a professional bureaucracy staffed by lawyers and clerks from the provinces, men who owed their careers to him rather than to the old Florentine families. And he paid them, audited them, and promoted them on performance, which in the Italy of the era was close to revolutionary. He reformed the courts, the tariffs, the marshes of the Maremma, the university at Pisa. He built a navy from nothing, founding a crusading order of knights, the Order of Santo Stefano, whose galleys fought corsairs across the Mediterranean and hung captured Turkish banners in their church in Pisa, where they still hang. And he pursued, patiently, through decades of imperial politics, the acquisition that turned a city-state into a country. The ancient Republic of Siena, Florence's rival for 4 centuries, fell to his armies in a brutal war of siege and starvation in the 1550s, and with it southern Tuscany. In 1569, a papal bull crowned the work, and the Duke of Florence became something no Italian had been before: Grand Duke of Tuscany, sovereign of a unified territorial state, with a crown designed for the occasion. The wool merchant's family had entered the book of European royalty, one rank below kings, and the entry was permanent. His marriage supplied the dynasty's other missing piece. In 1539, Cosimo married Eleonora di Toledo, daughter of the Spanish Viceroy of Naples, a match that bought him the protection of the Habsburg world system, and the political bargain turned, against every convention of the age, into a love story. Eleonora was proud, pious, beautiful, and as serious about money as her husband, running her own estates at a profit and lending to the state. She gave Cosimo 11 children, partnered him for 23 years, and appears beside her sons in Bronzino's portraits in dresses so magnificent that the paintings function as state documents, which they were, and the family she raised absorbed. In one terrible autumn, the kind of blow that breaks reigns, in 1562, travelling through the malarial Maremma, the fever took 2 of her sons within weeks, and then took Eleonora herself. At 40, Cosimo buried a wife and 2 children in a single season, aged a decade in a year by the testimony of the portraits, and began the slow withdrawal that ended with him handing daily government to his heir, Francesco, in 1564. A decade before his death, the machine he had built ran on without him, which was by his own lights. The whole point of having built it, the blood price of the reign was paid by others, and the ledger of it should be stated plainly, because Cosimo's Tuscany displayed, by modern standards, most of the features of an authoritarian surveillance state. The war on Siena starved a city of thousands down to a remnant. The political exiles were hunted by professional assassins across Europe for decades. Lorenzino, in Venice, being merely the most famous entry in a long file. At home, informers were paid. Correspondence was opened, and the law of treason reached thought and speech. The Republican tradition of Florence, the oldest and loudest in Europe, went silent in a single generation, and the silence had less to do with answered arguments than with the fact that the arguers were dead, exiled, or employed. A Florentine of 1570 could stand in the piazza where the Great Council had debated and where Savonarola had burned, and know that both the debating and the burning were finished, that history itself had been, in the fullest sense of the word, settled. What he saw, instead, rising all around him, was the settlement made visible, and that is the subject the next chapter takes up. Because Cosimo did more than govern the city the Renaissance built. He rebuilt the city into a portrait of his government, and the portrait is the thing the whole world now flies to Florence to see. Walk through Florence today, and you are walking through Cosimo's filing system. The proof begins with the most famous museum in Italy, and with what its name actually means. Uffizi is simply the Tuscan word for offices. In 1560, Cosimo commissioned Giorgio Vasari to build a colossal, U-shaped administrative headquarters beside the Palazzo Vecchio, 2 long wings running from the government square down to the river, to house under one roof the magistracies, guilds, courts, and archives of the Tuscan state. 13 agencies filed floor by floor in a single machine of grey stone and glass. The most visited gallery in the country. The building tourists queue around the block for, was born as a civil service complex. And the birth tells you exactly what the late Medici understood, that the world has since forgotten. Administration was the masterpiece. The paintings came later, upstairs, when Cosimo's son glassed in the top corridor to hang the family collections above the family bureaucracy. Art, literally stacked on government, which is the entire history of this dynasty expressed as a floor plan. The same year the Uffizi rose. The family moved house, and the move redrew the city's map of power. Eleonora had bought the huge unfinished palace across the river that Luca Pitti had begun a century earlier. The palace, designed to outshine the Medici, stalled when its builder fell with the party of the hill. The Medici finished it, tripled it, and made their rival's monument their royal residence. A joke in stone that required no inscription. Behind it, they laid out the Boboli Gardens, an amphitheatre of green climbing the hill, the model for the palace gardens of Europe for 2 centuries, Versailles included, and in 1565, for a royal wedding. Vasari solved the problem of the family's daily commute in 5 months of round-the-clock construction. The problem was assassination. The Medici remembered, institutionally, what had happened to 2 of them in a cathedral and 1 in a bedroom, and the new solution was the Corridoio Vasariano, an elevated, covered passageway nearly 1 kilometre long, running from the Palazzo Vecchio through the Uffizi, along the river, across the top of the Ponte Vecchio, above the shops, threading through a church, and into the Pitti Palace. The sovereign could now walk from his bedroom to his council chamber, over the heads of his subjects, without once touching a public street. For its first decades, the corridor passed above the stalls of the bridge's ancient tenants, the butchers, whose trade had claimed the Ponte Vecchio for centuries. And in 1593, Cosimo's son Ferdinando finally evicted them in favor of goldsmiths, who hold the bridge to this day, because the Grand Duke overhead preferred the smell of money. A century earlier, old Cosimo had walked to the market on foot, dressed like his neighbors, because being seen as ordinary was the family's armor. Now the family passed above the city, unseen, behind stone, because being extraordinary was the family's constitution. The corridor is the whole story of the Medici told in architecture, the journey from the street to the ceiling. What Cosimo grasped, more clearly than any ruler of his age, was that a new state needs a past, and that a past can be manufactured by professionals. His instrument was Vasari, painter, architect, impresario, and above all, author, whose Lives of the Artists, published under Cosimo's patronage and dedicated to him, helped establish the founding narrative of Western art history, organized as a story that began with Giotto, climaxed with Michelangelo, and unfolded, overwhelmingly, in Florence, under the enlightened hand of the House of Medici. The book is a masterpiece and a press release, and it works so completely that the modern world's very idea of the Renaissance, the term, the shape, the cast, the Florentine center of gravity, descends in large part from a Medici commission. Inside the Palazzo Vecchio, Vasari's workshop repainted the Republic's old council hall, the hall built for Savonarola's great council, into a ceiling cycle of Cosimo's victories. The Duke enthroned at the center of heaven in the panel where the Republic once debated. Old Cosimo and Lorenzo were repainted too, backdated into serene founding fathers. The family's rough century of bribes and exiles ironed into destiny. Every regime writes its own history. The Medici hired better writers. The city itself became the album. Bandinelli's Hercules went up beside Michelangelo's David at the palace door. The Republic's giant, now bracketed by the dukes. Cellini spent 9 years casting his bronze Perseus for the loggia beside them. The severed head of Medusa held out toward the square, and Florentines then and since have read the statue's address plainly, the snake-haired head as the Republic's discord, severed, displayed, and drained, art doing the work of a proclamation. Amanati's Neptune fountain announced the new navy. An equestrian Cosimo in bronze eventually surveyed the whole piazza. None of this was decoration in the modern sense, and the documents prove it, because the commissions ran through committees, iconographers, and the Duke's own annotations like any other state paperwork, painting, sculpture, urban planning, and history writing had been consolidated into a single department of legitimacy, and the department's output was so good, so overwhelming, that it achieved the ultimate goal of all propaganda. It stopped looking like propaganda and started looking like civilization itself. Here is the strangest turn in the whole account. It was, in fact, civilization itself, the cynical reading that the art was merely power's make-up. fails against the evidence of the objects, because the objects are supreme, and they are supreme in part because the money and the demand were sustained, generation after generation, at a level no honest market would have supported. Cosimo founded Europe's first Academy of Art, with Michelangelo as its symbolic head, converting craftsmen into professionals and Florence into the standard, the tapestry works, the porcelain experiments, the workshops of hard stone inlay that his heirs formalized into a grand ducal manufactory. All of it institutionalized beauty as a branch of government, and the branch outperformed and outlived every other branch. The armies are dust. The navy is gone. The bureaucracy was absorbed by later states. The dynasty itself failed, and the Department of Legitimacy is still processing visitors at the rate of millions a year, still doing exactly what it was built to do, persuading the world that Florence and the Medici were the summit of human achievement. It is the most successful government program in European history, and it succeeded by outliving the government. Cosimo I died in 1574, at 54, worn out, having buried a wife and 5 of his 11 children, wearing a grand ducal crown that had not existed when he was born, and ruling a state he had assembled out of a murder scene. The dynasty he refounded now had everything the first dynasty never sought: titles, thrones, fleets, a court, foreign princesses in the nursery, and royal blood incoming, and it settled onto its inheritance for a long, slow afternoon. The bank was a memory. The energy was spending down. But the family had 2 performances left on the European stage, and they were spectacular ones. A pair of Florentine women who carried the name to the throne of France and ruled it, and a Pisan mathematician on the family payroll who aimed a tube of lenses at the night sky and broke the roof off the universe. The last act of the Medici is not about Florence at all. It is about what the brand did after the business closed. By the 1570s, the dynasty had stopped ruling the Renaissance from Florence. What it did next was export the Medici method into royal marriage beds and scientific patronage, and the export ran further than the founders ever dreamed, because the most powerful Medici of the entire story never governed Florence at all. For most of her life, the French court called her the Italian woman, and it was an insult. Caterina, the orphan of chapter 14, 3 weeks old when her parents died, had spent her childhood as a political football, besieged in a Florentine convent during the last Republic, when hotheads in the city debated hanging the 11-year-old from the walls, and her adolescence as the bargaining chip of her cousin the Pope. Clement VII played the chip for the highest stake on the board, a marriage into the royal house of France, and in 1533 the 14-year-old banker's heiress married the 14-year-old second son of King Francis I. Florence toasted the match. France gagged on it. The Valois were marrying trade. The old nobility sneered. Shopkeeper blood into the blood of St. Louis. And when Clement died the following year, with half the dowry unpaid, the bride's stock fell to nothing. For 10 years she was a childless foreign wife of no importance, surviving at a hostile court on the one Medici asset that required no money: the ability to read a room, wait, and be underestimated. Then the heirs ahead of her husband died. Her decade of barrenness ended in a flood of 10 pregnancies. And in 1547, the shopkeeper's daughter was crowned Queen of France. The court still ignored her. Her husband, Henry II, ruled publicly beside his mistress, an ageless beauty, 20 years his senior, and gave her the crown jewels, the best chateau, and the affection, while the Queen bore the children and swallowed the arrangement in silence. Europe filed Catherine de' Medici away as a non-entity, and she let it. In the summer of 1559, at a tournament celebrating a peace treaty, a splintered lance went through the king's visor and into his brain, and he died in agony 10 days later. What France discovered over the following months is that it had spent 26 years misfiling the Queen. The kingdom Catherine now stood behind was cracking in half, along the same fault line Leo X had opened 40 years earlier. Catholic against Protestant, and the crown sat on the head of her sickly 15-year-old son. Then, within 18 months, on the head of her 10-year-old son, with Catherine as regent of a country sliding into religious civil war, she governed France, in one capacity or another, for nearly 30 years, through 8 civil wars, foursome, and every combination of alliance, edict, marriage, and betrayal the era offered, and she governed it with the complete Medici toolkit: patience, negotiation, festival, and cash. A queen who threw court spectacles that bankrupted treasuries because magnificence was armor, who tried repeatedly to legislate toleration decades before Europe was ready for the word, and who kept a doomed dynasty upright by pure managerial will. And one August night in 1572, with Paris packed for a royal wedding meant to seal peace between the faiths, the toolkit failed catastrophically. An assassination attempt on the Protestant leader, its authorship argued about for 4.5 centuries, spiraled into a preemptive strike against the Huguenot leadership gathered in the city, which spiraled into a general massacre. Mobs killing Protestant men, women, and children in the streets of Paris for days. The slaughter spreading city by city through France into the autumn. The dead counted in the thousands in Paris, and the tens of thousands beyond. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is the event history chained to Catherine's name, the black legend of the poisoning Italian queen sealed in Protestant pamphlets forever. What her actual hand signed remains genuinely disputed. What is beyond dispute is that she owned the government that let it happen, and that the massacre broke, for a century, the idea she had spent her regency defending, that Frenchmen of two faiths could live under one crown. She died in 1589, still working, weeks before the assassination of her last son ended the Valois line, and the Huguenot king who succeeded him reportedly said of her, with a soldier's fairness, that a woman with a dead husband and 5 small children, facing 2 families scheming for the crown, had needed to play strange parts to deceive everyone and still, as she did, protect her sons. I am surprised, he said, that she never did worse. 28 years after Catherine's wedding, Florence shipped France a second queen, and the second shipment was pure business. Marie de' Medici, granddaughter of Cosimo I, married King Henry IV in 1600, and the marriage contract was frank to the point of comedy. Her enormous dowry, partly an offset against the crushing debts the King of France already owed the Grand Duke of Tuscany, so that Paris wits called her the fat banker's daughter, and were not wrong on either count. She proved a difficult queen and a worse regent, extravagant, factional, dominated by favorites, eventually exiled by her own son and outmaneuvered by her own protégé, Cardinal Richelieu. And she died, broke in Cologne in the house of the painter Rubens, whom she had at least had the taste to employ. Her true bequest outweighs her politics, because between the two Medici queens, the family's blood entered the veins of European royalty permanently. Catherine's daughters and Marie's children married into Spain, England, and Savoy. Marie's daughter became Queen of England, wife of the beheaded Charles I, and Louis XIV, the Sun King, the very definition of European absolute monarchy, was Marie's grandson, which means the Palace of Versailles, the model of royal magnificence as state policy, was built by a great-grandson of the House of Medici, running on a colossal scale. The program the family had invented in a Florentine counting house, splendor as government, the wool merchants had aimed, across 3 centuries, at respectability. They overshot and became the ancestors of most of the crowned heads of Europe, and while the granddaughters conquered by marriage, the Grand Dukes at home made one investment that ranks, for sheer return to the human race, above everything else in the ledger. The Medici court had always kept mathematicians the way it kept sculptors. In 1589, the family's university at Pisa hired a sharp-tongued local professor named Galileo Galilei, who moonlighted as tutor to the heir, Cosimo, and who understood his patrons perfectly. When Galileo built his telescope in 1610 and saw what no human eye had ever seen, 4 moons circling Jupiter, worlds orbiting a world, a discovery that knocked a load-bearing wall out of the old Earth-centered cosmos, he reached for the oldest instrument in Florentine finance, the dedication. He named the moons the Medicean stars, after his pupil, now Grand Duke Cosimo II, and the Grand Duke responded exactly as 4 generations of training dictated, appointing Galileo court philosopher and mathematician at a princely salary with no teaching duties. The freedom to think purchased outright. For 2 decades, the arrangement was the glory of Florence, the most famous mind in Europe on the family payroll. Dinner table demonstrations for visiting cardinals, the heavens themselves carrying the family name. Then the mind collided with Rome over whether the earth moved, and the family that had once owned the papacy discovered the limits of the brand. Grand ducal diplomacy cushioned Galileo at every stage, housed him with ambassadors, lobbied cardinals, and could not, in the end, stop the Inquisition from forcing a 70-year-old man to his knees in 1633 to abjure the motion of the earth. Tuscany took him home and kept him, under house arrest, in his villa at Arcetri, in the hills above Florence, where he wrote his greatest book in captivity and died in 1642. Blind, still on the payroll, still the family's philosopher. The Medici had bankrolled the birth of modern science and had lacked the power to protect it. Both facts belong in the account. By then, the account itself was closing. The 17th century Grand Dukes were a diminishing series, pious, heavy, increasingly strange, presiding over a Tuscany, sliding into economic backwater as the world's trade routes moved to the Atlantic and left the Mediterranean, and Florence with it, becalmed. The wool trade died. The population sagged. The court kept its rituals and its collections, a museum with a government attached, and the family tree. once so dangerously fertile, narrowed to a point. Grand Duke Cosimo III reigned for 53 gloomy years and produced 3 children, of whom the elder heir died childless, and the younger, Gian Gastone, the last Grand Duke, a melancholy, intelligent, dissolute man, trapped in a dynastic marriage that produced nothing, spent his final years bedridden in the Pitti Palace, while the powers of Europe, without consulting Tuscany at all, traded his succession at the diplomatic table like the last asset of a bankrupt estate. He died in July of 1737, and the male line of the House of Medici, after 340 years, was extinct. The new Grand Duke, assigned by treaty, was Francis of Lorraine, husband of the Habsburg heiress Maria Theresa, and Austrian officials arrived to inventory their new possession, everything the family had ever gathered, the Botticellis and the bronzes, the libraries, the gems Lorenzo had scratched his name into. The telescope of Galileo now belonged, by every precedent of European succession, to the winners, to be crated and carted wherever the winners pleased. One person stood between the collections and the wagons, the last living member of the House of Medici, a proud, black-clad, 65-year-old widow. And what she did about it is the final chapter of this story. Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, only daughter of Cosimo III, had done everything the dynasty ever asked of its daughters, married to a German prince, the Elector Palatine. She had presided over a court on the Rhine for 25 years, childless, through a marriage to a husband whose disease, the gossip of Europe said plainly, had made children impossible. And when he died, she came home to Florence, to the Pitti Palace, to her dying brother and the dying house. She was, by the accounts of the diplomats who watched her, formidable, devout, glacially dignified, entirely aware that she was the last of her name, and entirely without illusions about what was coming. Tuscany itself was already lost, signed away by the powers before her brother was even dead. The Lorenas would rule, Vienna would instruct, and there was nothing a widow without an army could do about a throne. The collections were another matter. 3 centuries of accumulation stood in the palaces and galleries around her, the largest concentration of art on earth, legally the private property of her family, and therefore, at her brother's death, legally hers, and after her, by ordinary inheritance, the property of whichever foreign dynasty held the succession, free to scatter it, as war booty had scattered the collections of Mantua and Prague within living memory. Europe's courts assumed the scattering was a formality. The heirs of the bankers had one asset left, and the asset was movable. On the 31st of October, 1737, 3 months after her brother's death, Anna Maria Luisa sat down with representatives of the new Grand Duke and signed the instrument that history calls the Family Pact, and its operative clause deserves to be quoted in substance, because it is among the most consequential sentences a private person ever signed. The Electress ceded to the new Grand Duke and his successors all the galleries, paintings, statues, libraries, jewels, and other precious things inherited from her house, on 2 express and perpetual conditions: that none of it ever be transported or removed outside the capital and the Grand Ducal state, and that it remain for the ornament of the state, for the utility of the public, and to attract the curiosity of foreigners, Read that last phrase again, because it was written in 1737 for the benefit of the public and to draw visitors to the city. The last of the Medici, disposing of the family fortune, defined its purpose as public access and what a later century would call tourism, and she made the definition a condition of ownership, binding on sovereigns forever. She had no power to keep Tuscany. She used the power she had to make the art unstealable, by welding it, in perpetuity, to the ground. She spent her remaining 6 years as the keeper of the tombs, funding the completion of the family mausoleum at San Lorenzo, the octagon of dark marble behind Brunelleschi's church that swallowed the treasure of the crown. And she died in the Pitti Palace in February of 1743. In the same February week, the chroniclers noted, in which Giovanni de' Bicci had died 314 years earlier, the Florentines, who had rioted against her family, exiled it twice, and been conquered by it, turned out in the tens of thousands for the funeral of the last Medici, and the mourning was reported as genuine, because whatever the house had been, the city understood that something enormous was ending. She was placed in the crypt with her ancestors, the final deposit, and the name that had been a business, a party, a regime, a Papacy, and a royal house became, from that afternoon forward, only what she had arranged for it to become, an inscription on the door of the world's most famous collection, run the final accounting, because the story demands it. And the numbers are the strangest part. The bank failed completely, finished by 1494, and not one financial institution on earth descends from it. The political dynasty is extinct. The Tuscan state was absorbed. The titles are dust. The fleets are gone, and the family's proudest purchases, the Papacies, presided over the splitting of the church they were bought to command. By every measure, the age itself used power, territory, blood. The house of Medici lost everything it ever held. What survived was the collateral, the things the family bought when it was trying to buy other things: salvation, legitimacy, reputation, votes. The Botticellis commissioned to dress a parvenu's walls. The David ordered by a republic to defy them. The offices built to file their paperwork. The corridor built to carry them above the crowd. The library old Cosimo funded to launder his interest income. It all still stands in Florence, held there by a childless widow's contract. And the millions who file through the Uffizi every year, past the Primavera and the Venus, up the corridors where the Grand Ducal clerks once carried the tax rolls, are executing the terms of the family pact, clause by clause. Whether they know it or not, the visitors came for the curiosity, as she specified. They keep Florence rich, as she intended. Her ancestors had spent 3 centuries converting money into beauty on the theory that beauty was power. She performed the last conversion in the sequence, beauty into permanence, and hers is the only Medici transaction that has never stopped paying. There is an American footnote to close on, because the model she perfected crossed the Atlantic and built institutions every viewer of this story has walked through. When the industrial fortunes of the United States went looking, in the age of Carnegie and Morgan and Frick, for what money was ultimately for, the answer they reached for had a name, and the name was Medici. The newspapers called them America's Medici, the bankers building libraries, the oil men endowing museums, the railroad men buying Botticellis, And the phrase was exact, because the mechanism was exact. Private fortune converted into public magnificence. Magnificence into legitimacy. Legitimacy into a name that outlives the money. The Metropolitan, the Frick, the Morgan Library, the Getty. Every donor wall and every named gallery wing in America runs on the operating system. A Florentine wool clan wrote 5 centuries ago, and the system's terminal instruction, the one that makes all the others work, is the one Anna Maria Luisa entered in the last line of the last page. In the winter of 1737, keep the books open, let the public in. The family that began by hiding its power in a ledger ended by leaving the ledger to the world, and the world has been reading it ever since.